10, 20, 10 minutes. Y yo tampoco veía dónde. El problema es Luis que siempre se recoge todo.
Sí, no,
Pero tiene mucho que decir. Tiene mucho que decir. Vamos a decir.
Entonces ya llegamos a hora y 10, ya estamos tarde, vamos a pasar ya 10 minutos para las preguntas.
o sea, pensamos que solamente hay dos, podemos hablar 20 minutos.
No, 20 minutos. Usted. Y ahora un poquito más alto que es con solo. All right, let's get going on time here. Welcome to the session on Tarea Ordenamiento. We're going to have two speakers today. Two of the papers have been collapsed into one larger paper. The first paper is going to be presented by Jose Gabilondo, who teaches banking law, corporate finance, and tax at the FIU College of Law, where he serves as Associate Dean for Accreditation and Reporting. He has worked at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, the Office of the Controller of the Currency, and U.S. Department of the Treasury. His scholarship argues for full recognition of Cuba's sovereignty, independent of U.S. designs for regime change. He is the author of Bank Funding, Liquidity, and Capital Adequacy, and co-author of Regulation of Bank Financial Services Activities. Forthcoming, he has a monograph on institutional credit markets, structural regulation and funding, and a casebook on corporate finance law. The title of his presentation is Causation and Culpability in the Cuban Economy, Tarea Ordenamiento under the U.S. blockade. Let me just go ahead and state out who the other participants will be also. His paper will be followed by Rafael Romeo, who's an economist who works as president of Tech Systems since 2014. Before that, he worked for the International Monetary Fund since 2001, and he's also a past president of ASCE. The two discussants will be Lorenzo Perez, here to my right. He's a retired economist and ASCE founder. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania and has worked over 30 years at the IMF, leading teams in Brazil, Venezuela, Sudan, Armenia, Iraq, among other countries. And to my far right is Luis Ruiz, who's an international economist in Massachusetts. He is a former officer of international organizations, investment management companies, and international banks, and has taught international economics at universities in the U.S., South America, and Europe. Since Rafael's paper is a calculation of two, I don't know what title we use, but he'll tell us. All right, so without further ado, Jose.
First of all, I want to thank Jorge Perez Lopez, Jorge Esquirol, Gary, the Law Review for putting this together. I'm very happy to be here. This presentation is a little different from the other ones that I've done for ASCE because you're my institution. And I think FIU has a special place in the Cuban imaginary. FIU has the largest concentration of Cuban American faculty, students, and staff outside of Havana, really greater Havana. And you're familiar with the Cuban Research Institute. The College of Law has an especially thick tie to the Cuban American experience. The building is named after the Esquirol. We came about because of a special lobbying initiative by Cuban American legislators and African American legislators. And the clinic is linked to Cuba's frozen assets because much of it was funded after an award to survivors of the Brothers to the Rescue shoot using Cuba's frozen assets. This is our statutory mission. I see the mission a little differently, but Dean alluded to it. I think we do have a sort of tie to Cuba. That's part of what we're supposed to be doing. My vision is a little more ethno-nationalist. That's something I share with Steve Bannon. Although different ethnicity, different context, but a project similar to that. And just a couple of words about ASCE, because I know a lot of you folks don't know. Cuba is a country that's broken into two: Cuba island, Cuba diaspora. ASCE holds that space, and it is in many ways, I see it as a placeholder for this unfinished task that I think so many Cuban Americans have of nation building and nation rebuilding. ASCE is unusual because it brings together economists and lawyers and policy professionals. And I just want to point out that when it comes to reform, the Cuban economists have been much more progressive than Cuban lawyers. You can point to many examples of Cuban economists. I've tried to list some of them are here, who I think are syncretic in the sense that they're heterodox. They remain connected to Cuba, but they're much less dogmatic than most of the lawyers, so I just wanted to point that out. So my paper is about, and first I have to apologize to Lorenzo and Luis because my presentation has changed so much since the paper that I gave them, and they were asked to do this unfair thing. So as they're judging me, don't judge them. So I'm grateful for their feedback. So I'll start by saying what the Tarea Ordenamiento is. It's a series of macroeconomic reforms. It's called the Structural Adjustment Program. And then I want to talk about some of the difficulties of evaluating the Tarea. Structural adjustment is hard to evaluate under the best of circumstances because it's a long-term project that affects many aspects of the economy, usually has anguishing short-term costs. When you're evaluating the policy of the Cuban government, it's even more complicated, the economic policy, because the U.S. blockade has a very important effect on the policy options that the Cuban government has. And there is also this, I think of it as the Cuba as defective sovereign narrative. There's this sense that there are countries in the world, and then there's Cuba. So we apply one set of standards to sovereign power, but then when we're going to talk about Cuba, we have to play a different standard. And I really contest that. And the gist of my comments is that it's too early to know, but I'm more sanguine about the Tarea and what it represents. And I see it as an original hybrid attempt to do structural adjustment Cuban style. And I think that it does reflect a very ambivalent embrace of market dynamics, but it's an embrace nonetheless. And under protest, but it's an embrace. So just to clarify, some of us have referred to it. After the Cuban Revolution, Cuba moved away from the U.S. and formed part of the Soviet trading bloc, GAME, and it was subsidized. The terms of trade. Cuba sold certain products at a premium over market, and they bought certain products at a discount over market, and that spread stabilized the economy and the purchasing power of the peso. As it constructed the socialist state, Cuba became the universal intermediary, eating up the wholesale sector and inserting itself in every activity. Well, the special period started after the dissolution of the GAME, and for Cuba, the loss of its export and import partners. The title comes from Fidel Castro in 1990. He made a speech and he said it was el periodo especial en época de paz. It's again, Garcia Marquez were great friends, and I hear the lyricism in that phrase. I don't think the periodo especial has ever actually ended in terms of a formal policy declaration. I'm not sure, but in any event, it's relevant because I see the Tarea as relating back to 1990. And I see the Tarea as a way to continue liberalization projects that were begun, albeit ambivalently and half-heartedly, but were then frozen. So it's like in 1991, Cuba took the first step, and this is another step. That is how I see it. I mean, some of the things that happened during the periodo especial is Cuba introduced the convertible peso, which is basically a politically correct version of the dollar whose value was pegged to the dollar. And we talked about some of the reforms. And then earlier panelists did a really good job of talking about the zeitgeist for the Tarea. There's some liberalization. It's true, in 2017, there was an intensification of sanctions. And in a way, Cuba was already in structural adjustment mode. I think it has been since 1990. Now, there was a lot that was wrong in very original ways. Cuba's a fascinating laboratory because it's you see things there that you won't see anywhere else in terms of economic institutions. So it's very interesting in that way. So one of the aspects, as I see it, I think the main point of the Tarea is to create a functional price system. The price system was not functional. I think that's the overarching goal of the Tarea. And part of that required reforming the currency because Cuba had, I think, 3 currencies but no money. In the sense that no single currency that could do all of the things that you have to do in order to be money, be a unit of account, a store of value, and a medium of exchange. There was the national peso, the convertible peso, and the US dollar. Maybe the US dollar was closest, although it wasn't always legal tender, but it's a very politically incorrect currency for Cuba to have. So what exactly is the Tarea? Tarea is Spanish, it's nothing as homework or task. Ordenamiento, system because it's, to use a word that's used by the government to describe it a lot, it's transversal in the sense that the reforms that it makes cut through the entire economy in deep structural ways. Now, some of the things that were done is, well, and I have a large article coming out next year that goes into much more detail about this. They retired the convertible peso. They've begun to retire the convertible peso because they want to make the national peso the real national currency. That meant redesignating assets and liabilities that were designated otherwise. They adopted a single peso dollar rate, and that was in a way even more important than convertible peso because as many folks in ASCE have talked about, one of the economy's greatest problems was not only having all 3 currencies, but a system of multiple internal exchange rates that the government used that essentially subsidized some parts of its activities, but penalized others. And it's not clear to me whether the government ever had a set of books, internal inside books, that actually presented a meaningful net account of that. I don't know. I mean, I don't know that we'll ever know. So their subsidies were also reduced on products. The reform uses this phrase, we're going to subsidize people, not products, in the sense that they want to focus more on means testing. And wages and pensions and welfare transfers were increased because these changes would lead to inflation, and they have, and they really have. Cuba is in a state of humanitarian crisis. I defer to Carmelo's measurement of inflation. He had extremely good granular data about inflation. There's been there's been a decline in the standard of living. Electricity, this was also alluded to, is really in a crisis state. There are apagones nearly every day. It's lost 20% of its electrical capacity. Human Rights Watch recently issued a report on the government's reactions to the J11 protests. And if you go online, based on where you live, you can see the schedule of the blackouts and brownouts. So this is really just been assumed to be a fact of life. All right. So the title of my paper talks about causation and culpability. I think economists explain, lawyers blame. And that's because, part of our profession is organized around this idea. You broke it, you pay for it. Liability generally follows causation. And in law, causation is a technical requirement in many causes of action. And so I think, lawyers think about, I think I have 9 minutes.
You have 10 minutes.
Oh, 10 minutes. Oh, that's 3 jumps. So lawyers think about this a lot. They think about this a lot, and there are different ways to deal with the problem of causation. I think the specific problem with judging the tarea is multiple concurrent causes. everything that happens in the tarea, during the tarea, is overdetermined. There are many, many effects. This morning, Carmelo, he came up with 6 of them. I would have added, the U.S. sanctions in general. And so, lawyers have to deal with this, these challenges. There's an idea I really like that comes out of tort law, and it's the notion of proximate cause. It's a situation where you have multiple causes in fact that have produced an outcome. You have to pick one. You're going to pick one, but that will determine who pays, what the liability is. And so, and that is the proximate cause. It's such a legalese, it's a wonderful word. Whenever you see it used, be on the lookout, because you can be sure there's a lot that has gone on behind that the allocation of something as proximate. Now, I think that it's hard. It's actually extremely hard to come up with proximate cause for who has broken the U.S. economy and who's going to pay, although we all know that in a very material way, Cubans pay every day for the broken part of their economy. So, the tarea is a version of what's called a structural adjustment program, which is really a series that can take different forms, but they're packages of economic reforms that affect how a state is financed, how it spends money, how it manages its currency, the presence of government ownership in key industries. And I really associate structural adjustment with the economic order created after Bretton Woods in terms of the establishment of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Structural adjustment programs are usually curated by the IMF, and the IMF is there to provide funding to help finance and deal and ameliorate the anguishing short-term costs that typically occur. And I think in general, the thrust of these programs is often to make the state recede from its role in the economy. And by the way, there are people, Lorenzo and Luis both know much more about this. They were at the IMF as well as some of the other folks here. So, this is really a very educated panel when it comes to these issues. So again, it's hard. It's really hard to evaluate structural adjustment programs. One, they're just so complex. And the other is the time interval. How long do you have to wait to decide how your kids turned out? No, I think that's about how long you have to wait to come up with any kind of, even maybe an interim assessment about how structural adjustment is going. It's complex because it's different based on when you look at it. Now, and it's also austerity, hardship, and horror is a standard consequence of structural adjustment programs. There was a study done, looked at 30 countries that had received funding through IMF conditionality, and it documented a statistically significant increase in suicide rates. And there are other studies like that. So that's just one data point, but it is to say that structural adjustment, I think, is permanently contestable. It's permanently contestable because it involves these fundamental values that are about which we will have different views. Now, I think in the case of Cuba, it's even more complicated. And it's also a more interesting opportunity if you are interested in situated reasoning or motivated reasoning, if you're interested in understanding how do the values that people have impact the conclusions that they reach, not always in an explicit way. Carmelo referred this morning to these, I think he called them ideologies, but he talked about these two polarizing ideologies. And I want to say a little bit about that, in part because of who we are, as I think a largely Cuban American school, because many of our students come from this community and live these issues. Now, to my way of thinking, there are two registers. Oh, wow. Okay, so, well, there are two registers. There are two ways of thinking about Cuba. And, I think there's exile speak, and they're systems because they come together and they operate as a system. So I think where you are, not using one word doesn't mean that you're embedded in that paradigm. For example, I would say I'm mostly embedded in the island speak paradigm, but I use the words on the left sometimes. So a single word is not dispositive. The question is that word the tip of some system that one should look at? I think that makes it hard to reach conclusions, but also very rich in terms of understanding our moral reasoning. So, like I said, I'm more sanguine about the tarea, and I just want to point out a couple of things that it does. It feels more technocratic and personalized, and I think there is an ambivalent embrace of market institutions, and I think it qualifies the equality norm. Until recently, Marino Murillo Jorge he was sort of the czar of the lineamientos, and he was the face of the lineamientos on Mesa Redonda, which is a program that you really have to watch if you want to understand what is going on in the Cuban government. You can't find legislative history about these things. So you have to hear officials and make your own decisions about what they say. I really was very impressed with him. He was the one who introduced and explained the tarea. I think one reason why I like him is because he sounds like an academic, not a politician. And in his interviews, he would be describing the tarea, and he would say, it's very interesting, it's very interesting, it's very interesting. He didn't know how it would turn out, and he wasn't making many promises. And I found that kind of open-ended engagement, I found it very interesting. And I found it very interesting, right. So some specific things. There was a period of time during the implementation of the tarea when in his talks on Mesa Redonda, he never mentioned US sanctions. And I thought that was very interesting because he was really focused on this is the endogamos, this is the world we have, what can we do? Forget the blaming. That ended, unfortunately, in the spring, but that did happen. He said things like, okay, he's not citing Frederick Hayek, but he recognizes, the market exists independently of our will. He's very familiar with price discovery versus the socialist-style price formation, where prices are too important to be left for markets to decide. The state is going to have to do that. So he seems quite open-minded. There was a reference to the losses that several I think it was 500 Cuban companies as a result of the tarea were going to suffer a loss. And he said, well, we're going to finance that loss initially. But he talked about nominalization of the loss. No idea. I mean, that's not a gap idea, but I viewed it as, oh, he's reflecting the desire to move towards more conventional accounting recognition of profit and loss. I found that very interesting. But perhaps what I found most surprising was the statement of regarding equality. Well, that's my timer, but you gave me a couple of extra minutes, so I have enough time to finish this one. So obviously, equality has always been at the heart of the Cuban Revolution, but since the tarea, the president and Murillo Jorge, and really any time it's mentioned, this is how they define equality: to distribute according to the socialist principle. The one who contributes the most, the one who works the most, the one who works the most efficiently will earn more and be better off. I thought that was the Protestant work ethic. I don't see that as the socialist principle. And that's different from the socialist principle as it has been deployed historically. And what that means is he's countenancing inequality. He's creating a state-sanctioned rationale for, yes, there is inequality, there's more inequality coming, and here's a way of legalizing it. Professor Dominguez talked about how the Constitution legalized Cuba's use of force in explicit terms. And I think at an ideological level, that's what this change means. So, anyways, I'll stop there and thank you very much. And thank you for
And thank you very much. The next speaker, Rafael? You're on? Okay. Rafael, you get more time because you have two papers.
Yeah.
I expect.
So
You
it's
deliver-
substantive, it's
I
substantive.
expect you to deliver twice as
It's gotta
fast.
be twice, twice as hard.
Yeah, okay.
All right, thank you all very much, thank you, panel and organizers, Gary, Lorenzo, Luis, and obviously FIU for inviting us. So, this is joint work, as Luis Locay mentioned, we have two papers, and the issuance of an official exchange rate at 120 in August kind of ruined one of our two papers, so that's why we're going to present our work as it is. This is a research conference, so we are nothing if not bold. So we present our research as it is ongoing, and we basically are rethinking how we're going to present. And I will try to be very careful in what I'm showing so that you guys can understand. We're going to make it very visual so you see where we are. But what we're going to talk about is, if you want to get it down to its crux, it is that when you unify a currency, the people who were benefiting from the disunity need to be dealt with. The person who had access to the Cuban convertible peso, the CUC in the past, this has been an obsession of ours since 2008, is a subsidized individual. You see this in Venezuela, which is our other sort of client state that we deal with. And when you unify a currency, you have to deal with that subsidy. That is a painful choice. And you can avoid it in the short term when we think that's what they did, and then you abandon it. And so what we're going to do is project when they would abandon it. And they turned out to abandon it as we were projecting it, so they didn't even last as long as the conference, which is sad. And we're going to talk about the main financier, which is Venezuela. And so first, let me say a couple things. Gabriel is an employee of the International Monetary Fund. Most of the people on this paper, on these two papers, were a long time there or are now. His views don't reflect the fund. We are a private sector company. We're not your financial advisor. Do not go and buy a house in Cuba on my advice. So, introduction. We're going to talk about measures of Venezuela's economy. You're going to see where we are people who are very into data, obsessed with data, because we believe there's value in getting the data of Cuba, the official data, as well as what we can get on our own. We get substantial amounts of data without consulting from the government from inside Cuba, just by scraping your own databases. We're going to review some policy developments and how we see it in the macro side, and then we're going to talk about this issue that will arise as I present the data. It will become obvious to you that there are problems. They are to be expected in countries that do big evaluations. And so you can't really understand the 20 to 21 data so easily. And so we're going to use real sector data to talk about what happened in Cuba. I'll explain what that means. And you will see the bottom line here is, this is a self-inflicted wound on the part of the Cuban government. This is not Venezuela. This is not the US embargo. This is a self-inflicted wound that they did. They are worse off today than they were before. And it's just poor execution. That is our view. So let's talk first about exchange rate unification, policy and results, what they've achieved. So to start, this is a very important, I don't know which one you guys are looking at. I'm going to point to this one. So this is the parallel exchange rate. Laser. You know what? I do better with the mouse. You guys see the mouse? No, you don't. This is the parallel exchange. The pink line is the parallel exchange rate.
It's the red button.
Yeah, but it doesn't. The red button shows on the word, but not. Okay, there we go. So that thing is moving up. This is the official exchange rate here. This is 24. So we begin collecting data on Cuba right away, but we really only start using it around the 1st of March. Because when you have a parallel market develop, the initial observations are it's like going to a flea market. There's no depth. There's no record of transactions. So nobody trusts those numbers. You have to wait a month or two. So as soon as they start issuing in January 21, they start issuing a unified currency at 24-1, we start looking at the parallel exchange rate inside Cuba through the internet, and we start scraping what the transactions are. This is much like this thing in Toque where you guys look, except you will see that we get volumes, we probably have 300,000 observations right now of people who are actually trading currency inside Cuba. And we're going to start documenting on March 1st because we don't trust these first 2 months of data because they're wild and they're sort of, it's noisy. But this looks like a real market. And so they start here, and within a reasonable time period, they're already at almost 100% devalued on the parallel market. And it'll keep going up and up and up. And what we're showing here is this panoplia of policies that are going out the door. We were able to find one summary, which is that apparently they had 63 measures in agriculture, more than 3,000 for micro enterprises, 155 approved measures, and so on. It's really too much to document all of the things that they did. I think one of the morning presenters described it as throwing mud at the wall to see what sticks. So it feels like they were doing a lot of different policies as they went along. There's a few important ones that are interesting to us. One is that they prohibit the sale of dollars at the airport. And that's an obvious thing to do. You'll see that in other places like Venezuela, because you cannot sell a widget for 24 that someone could turn around and sell for 50, because that is a recipe for going broke, because you are selling an object at 50% discount. This happens in many, many countries. Venezuela is an exhibit A of this, because they've done multiple currency arrangements. It leads to corruption, it leads to all sorts of problems, because the government is once again subsidizing a sector. It is the person who has access to dollars at 24 can buy them at 24 and turn right around and sell them at 50. I can tell you exactly what price they're selling it at. Wherever this line is, that's the price. And I can tell you these are real transactions that we're scraping. So these are going. This was a big one for us. And then the banking sector, dollar-denominated accounts would be made illegal within 30 days to us. That jumped out at us. We had a paper on this last year as well. That happened on June 11th. They put a 30-day window on that, and July 11th you had protests. So we think it's an amazing coincidence. So we go from there, and then you keep going. There's obviously data issues. This is something that's being divided by small numbers, so there might not be too many observations, and we don't believe that's a real number. And it goes, and you see this run at the end of the year, and then it keeps going, and today, they start selling at 120. So that, to us, spells the end. You now have a multiple exchange rate regime. That is the end of a unified exchange rate in Cuba. So the unified exchange rate can be dated from January 1, 2021 to August, 20th, whatever the day was that they started doing it in 2022. That's the life of this thing. And by the way, my understanding is they didn't even sell at 120. The Cadecas immediately started selling at like 124, which is significant. It's like 3% more than what you said you would. So that's where we're at here. This is the phenomenon that we're looking at. And so let's keep going. So part of the data that we get, and this is more just to show you the source of these data. This is going to be the real data. These are outages in Etexa. And the size of the bar is the number of watts that were lost that day inside Cuba. And once again, we can get those. This is official data. We can get it from inside Cuba. And you can see on the left-hand side, we're showing the volume of goop that was traded on the right scale. And the right-hand side is the depreciation that day. And so clearly there seems to be, the currency appreciates. Ironically, it gets better as the number goes down. It appreciates as electricity gets weaker, probably because people are having to buy dollars to make, they're having to deal with excess demand. But what is interesting to us is not this phenomenon, because we can't really map it to anything yet. But certainly, this is a recipe for discontent. And in fact, in the data that we get the source of this one is Facebook. You can see the comments that people make are fantastic, and they're just railing about the electricity company, and one lady was super respectful and whatnot, because everybody on Facebook, you can see who put the comments in, Facebook is identity, revealing. So this lady says, I don't know why they did some, some parade for kids when they could have put the money into the electricity and things like that. So they're even trying to be constructive, but certainly some of the comments are worth reading. So that phenomenon, this phenomenon, is what we believe is a self-inflicted wound. It is something that failed. And we now want to turn, well, did it fail because of external reasons or internal reasons? What do the data tell us? And so this is from our 2009 paper. This is a direct quote from, not ours, because I didn't do it. It was Gabriel, DeBell, and Andy Wolf. This is basically the improvement in the net external services revenue. In other words, doctors in Venezuela is an expected result from devaluing, because now you're going to make more money, and that'll allow you to unify without actually addressing these subsidy issues in the short run. But in the long run, you just burn your NIR, and you're back to where you were, and you reissue new two currencies, you fail. So they never tackled, we believe they never tackled any internal distribution issue. With all of their talk of, let's improve whatever, the cooperatives are going to replace the socialist model, or all of it. I'm not going to get into the whole story. None of it was done. The whole thing is an abject failure. And I will show you data where you cannot, maybe the estimation is crap, but whatever, you cannot point externally at this phenomenon. So the first is the balance of payments. So obviously you look here, we'll go through this slowly, you look here, this is your services balance. This is official data. They put out data through 2021. We did have to estimate two things here. So we have official data everywhere except for two colors on this graph. First is going to be this color here, this wine color, and only for 2020 and 2021. And what we did is we made the assumption that it's the same as before. And the second is this light blue down here, which we did the same thing. We assumed it's the same as before. It may be very different, but we're assuming it for 2 years, not for one. So this is not a 2021 event. It is a 2020 and 2021 event. And what you need to see is, this is services which went way up because they export services. And this is the merchandise balance. Nothing improved. Everything got worse. So they continue to import everything under the sun. They export nothing. And they're basically borrowing from the rest of the world. When you look at a country from the perspective of the International Monetary Fund or just general economists, there are two kinds of borrowing that you can do. You can borrow as a government or you can borrow as a country. This account is your borrowing vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And you can see that it goes to -4. So this graph is called the contribution to growth graph. So all of these bars add up to the number in red. So you see the big -3.8 is 2008. That was the global financial crisis. Then it goes 2.3, 2.1. You see, they're going. This is the current account. And so then it goes drop to -4. That's because they're going all the way down on their imports, which is bizarre because you just had a devaluation. In other words, they didn't take the peso and set it to 5 or to 7 or to 12, which would have taken the average Cuban worker, and this is the counterfactual you have to keep in mind. They could have gone with one group of people that had access to dollars at 1 coup, and another group of people that had access to dollars at 24 coups or pesos, and they could have met in the middle. And by meeting in the middle, they would have had much less inflationary pressure. They would not have had the pressure on salaries. In fact, what you would have done is you would have given your poorest people in the country a raise at the expense of cutting off to the people who are connected. That would have been the knee-jerk, low-level entry into the IMF question at the interview. Where is the rate? If one is at 1-to-1 and one is at 24-to-1, where is the rate? It just answers itself. It's somewhere in the middle. But 24 turned out to be the lower bound after you unchain this inflationary spiral. And frankly, what we see here, this is so problematic. We start looking at this and saying there's data problems. And that's to be expected when you have inflation going to When the exchange rate goes to 140, your official rate is at 40, or at 24, and it used to be at 1. You have what are called just knock-on effects on everything, on statistics, on the real economy. You don't know what you're looking at. And so there's something to be said for not trusting many of these numbers, and that's an issue that it is recurring in our work. And so we have a solution. And so the next is, these are the NIPA account, the National Income and Product accounts. Again, all official data for Cuba. Cuba publishes every year through the end of 2021, through the first year of the unification of this currency. They publish consumption and investment, and they do it in real terms. And you can see that C plus I has to equal G. This is public and private consumption, and they can do that through accounts where they say, look, everybody got paid salaries, or there's profits to the firms, or there's blah, blah, blah. It's a way of taking apart GDP. I'm not going to go into it because it is the boringest part of economics. It is the statistical explanations of how economics numbers are done. But you can do it, and you can show consumption and investment, and guess what? In this year, it's the only time that these two numbers, they get very close to 100% of GDP. They never go over it, except 2021, they go way over it. So we think there's a problem here, at that 23.8. We don't know what the investment numbers are, but they're garbage. So, and we might be wrong, maybe they have a great story. We're missing 3 numbers here to make this completely work, which is rents, transfers, and excedente bruto nacional, which is some sort of external investment account. But there's a problem here. They're going over the normal GDP, and this never happens in Cuba's case. It's essentially a cash in advance economy. Now here you see the services account, and again, we see more data problems because they're going to have a balance. This is a fantastic balance to have. If you're the government and you have Cuban doctors sitting abroad, and you've been getting hurt because your principal client for these Cuban doctors is your buddies down in Caracas, and they're going from whatever this number is here, it's 10.7 to 8.9 to 5.8. All of a sudden, the same guys sitting in the same rural area of Venezuela is generating 23% of GDP. This is a significant revenue gain for any country in the world. That's what you would expect to see from a devaluation. That's exactly what you would expect. They should be doing great. They should be doing fantastic. And instead you see them running these deficits. This is what their fiscal accounts look like. It is a disaster. This is 2020. It's the year with COVID, which is 18% fiscal deficit on 48% of GDP spending. Next year, they go to 11% fiscal deficit on 55% spending, which is nuts. Because you just came out of a 48, one of your largest, this is almost Soviet Union level. And they're spending 48% of their GDP here, and it's a small GDP, I get it, it's a small GDP because the economy crashed. But then they go to 55 on the recovery. And that's inflation passing through, they're giving their people raises, etc. They're trying to contend with this self-inflicted wound by printing money and throwing it out at people. This is what we believe. And look at their revenue, it goes from 30 to 44. They're doing fantastic on revenue, fantastic. But it's not enough, because now they're behind the 8 ball. Now they're printing, now they didn't give. They did not give the poorest people in the country money. They protected their system of rationing US dollars. And this is the final sort of growth / external financing issue that we see. So this is going to be, again, contribution to growth. And so now we're going to do something, which is we're going to look at growth starting, let's say in 2017, we just pick a year, and we say, how do you grow every year beyond that? So 2021, you are 8% below 2017. In 2020, you're 9.1% below 2017. This is, roughly speaking, your 1.1, 1.3% growth last year. You see? So it's getting worse and worse. This is the COVID year, and then you see they improved by 1% or so. When you have a devaluation of the size that they had, you should get at least a short-run bump. That 1% is not fantastic. And why do we say that? Because all of growth is coming from public assistance growing in real terms, construction growing at 1% over the 4 or 5 year period. This is 1% cumulative. This is now 1% in 2021. This is 1% for the whole period. Meanwhile, all of the stuff that you're supposed to become more competitive on as you devalue is sitting in the, you know, in the toilet. So what do we have? Hotels and restaurants did a little bit better than last year. Instead of negative 1.8, it's negative 1.5. So it grew a little bit in the last year. But it's still 1.5% lower than it was 4 or 5 years ago. Ditto manufacturing, which is supposed to be one of the few things that gets a bump when you devalue because you become more competitive, like the Chinese. Trump was always whining that they had a non-competitive currency practice. This is what he means. Normal countries, when you devalue, you bump up your exports. Not here. Continues to be a decline. And the same with commercial stuff and blah, blah, blah. Education is no good. So, although it gets better from previous year. And so nothing is working as it should be in this place because you haven't really done anything. All you did was relabel your dual currency system and create a 18-month window where you have a fake unified currency that is completely unsustainable. And we know that because you keep turning the spigot off on dollars like you did at the airport, like you did at the banks. Because every day Cubans wake up and they say, I can get $1 for 24 and I can turn around and sell it at this price, that price. So if I could buy it at 24 and sell it at that price, why not do that? And that's what they created. They never unified the currency. All they did was turn on the inflation machine. And so so then we get to the next question, which is, how is this ordenamiento being impacted? Why isn't Venezuela stepping in to cover that gap? Why isn't, maybe it's their fault. Maybe it's not the Cubans making a mistake. Maybe it's the embargo. Let's see. So we're going to have two challenges. One is and I've spent a lot of time talking about the data challenges, which are I believe the data that they publish, I just don't believe that it's complete yet, and I don't know how to interpret some of it, and maybe we need more time, maybe next year it'll become clear how they're treating these larger numbers. When your GDP goes from, you know, a number that looks like 100 to a number that looks like 500, everything is you've lost your anchor in many ways. You can't remember what the old number was because it's so different. Things like that. So growth rates don't make sense. Everything goes crazy. That's why you see me present everything in percent of GDP, because we've lost our anchor. And so certainly the external data are hugely problematic in Cuba, but we want to find solutions. And guess what? It's equally problematic in Venezuela, because Venezuela doesn't publish anything. You're talking about a country that in the old days, when I worked on it, they did about 3.1 to 3.5. They asserted 3.5 million barrels a day. We knew it was more like 3.1 or 3.2 million barrels a day. But today, OPEC reported them at 600,000 last year. So they're very, very, very bad. This is a country that has collapsed. And so you have the external problems on the data reporting from the Cuban side and from the Venezuela side. And then you also have a second problem, which is there's these ongoing deep structural changes that are happening, the kinds of changes that you see in a place like Venezuela. So what do I mean by a structural change? It doesn't have to be structural policy change. It could be a structural change within the economy, the structure of the economy itself. For example, if you were a great oil producer and through negligence and poor governance, you went from being one of the world's top producers to being, you know, below Trinidad and Tobago, that's a structural change. If you lost 15, 20% of your population because they moved to another country, like it happened in Venezuela, that's a structural change. So there are these big structural changes. If Cuba ties itself to this country, that is a structural change. That's a deep structural change. If they tie themselves to the Soviet Union and then get untied, that's a structural change. And we're going to go back 50 years because we're going to solve these two problems by using real data. So we're going to do linear regression with time varying coefficients, and what we're going to do is real data. So we're going to treat these countries like what's called the Clower constraint or a cash in advance constraint. These are countries where we don't need to look at this problematic external data to see what's going on. We could look at the real sector. They're so poorly governed. Oh, wow. They're so poorly governed that, I got it. They're like a person with no, you know, it's like a person who lives paycheck to paycheck in an extreme sense.
Paper number 2, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is like they're melding into the same, yeah, it's paper number 2. So, I'm not sure where paper number 1 ended, it's good. The external part is part of paper 2 as well. So, here's a problem.
if you have somebody who lives paycheck to paycheck and gets payday loans and so on, that is a person who is cash in advance. Take the payday loan away. They really are cash in advance. They have to have cash in their hand to spend. So I don't need to know how much money the person has. All I need to do is see what they buy. And I know what they have. You see? And so we believe that that's the case for Cuba. We believe it's the case for Venezuela as well, but this is not about Venezuela, it's about Cuba. And so we want to know, did its financing constraints hurt it in 2021 when it did this tarea de ordenamiento or not? And as a byproduct, what else happened around that time? How bad was it? How good was it? And this external financing morass that they have, because this currency unification is essentially a financing item. In fact, if you take out your currency right now, your US dollars, I realize we're in a high inflation environment as well, but it's not as bad as there. You will see that it is a US Treasury note. It is a debt. It is just debt from the Treasury. So if you take your US dollar to the Treasury, they'll give you back 100 pennies, because that's how they pay. They pay their debt in their own currency, but it is a US government debt. And Cuba's currency is debt, so it is all about the financing of that country. We want to know if it's external financing that did this to them, or is it internal? I've told you what we think, so we're going to do linear time varying regression coefficients. All this means is we're going to regress Cuba's real GDP on Russia, Venezuela, and we did a bunch of other countries, but they're irrelevant. And the reason we want to do that is because Russia to us is the rest of the world. There is no other country that represents Cuba's external relations as well as Russia, because we're going to go back 50 years. And then we're going to do Venezuela, because Venezuela is this colony slash sugar daddy, depending on how you want to look at it, that has been paying for them for an extended period. And then we will figure out what happened in Cuba versus what happened in these other two. But because they change so much their relationship, we have a very special kind of regression that allows the change to not be constant. It moves with the data. And so it finds optimally what we're doing. It's almost like data mining in some ways. And that will allow us to see two things: what the impact of these things are and how those changes have changed over time, how Cuba has become more dependent. This is just data issues. We're going to get real GDP data, not because we love real GDP or because we think it's so insightful to look at Cuba's growth rate, but because we can't, at this point, trust anything else. So all of the other data that I showed for 2021, for the tarea de ordenamiento, we can't anchor on it because we have real questions about it. And maybe the questions have really good answers, by the way. I might be back in 2023 and say, fantastic, look, and then it was this and it was this. But with these kinds of numbers changing, we're going to stick with the real GDP data and get what we can out of there. There is a cost to this. We cannot answer the questions with the specificity that we could if we had balance of payments data, if the financial and investment account data, if we had the entire change in the net international investment position, we could see how they distributed the losses inside their economy, who stopped getting access to dollars. We believe nobody stopped. The same people who had it before have it now. So that's why we stick with the real GDP data, in case some of you are wondering. And we're going to put 3 results. I have like 3 minutes. These are great results because they're easy to transmit. So the first is we're going to show that Venezuela had no impact in Cuba. None. Last year. Now, if you need an intuitive reason for this, they're already at the bottom when COVID hit. So we're going from 2020 to 2021. These guys unified the currency the year after COVID. They're already at the bottom of the barrel. And the average oil price goes from 40 to 70 in 2021. So why would Venezuela be a laggard? Its production is not going to get any worse. It's not like the relationship with Cuba and Venezuela deteriorated in any way. And you almost double their annual revenue. It is intuitive that Venezuela is not the case. And so here's one of the main graphs. And this is really the crux of what we want to show. So the blue is Russia. Remember, it's Russia plus the rest of the world. Russia is the only country that we're going to have in here that can capture Europe and Spain and blah, blah, blah. So it's capturing what is the influence of this country on Cuba's GDP with this time-varying methodology that recognizes that Russia was Really important from 1970 to 1995, let's say, and not so much now. Then, the green part is Venezuela, all right? And then the pink part is Cuban policy, blah, 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 idiosyncratic stuff. It's basically a residual. So let me point out if this is intuitive or not. If you look here, where Cuba is having a big impact on its own growth rate, so the blue line is the detrended growth. You take out the recessions, and this is sort of your long-term growth rate. Look at how high it goes here, and this was this mysterious data revision, but it was also the source of reforms in 05 and 06. I've never really convinced myself of what this is, but it's real. You can see it in the data. You can see that the algorithm is not picking up Venezuela. It's not blaming it on Russia. Then you look at 2015, there's another huge contribution to Cuba. This one I think might be real. I think that the data is picking up that there was no change in anything related to Russia or Venezuela. In fact, Venezuela starts deteriorating in a very serious way. But this was the year that Obama went there. He went in 2014, and they had all of this opening and all of this stuff, and we're gonna, more flights and this, that, and the other thing. And so they got a little bump from their internal liberalizations. So if you ever want to see evidence that perhaps if they liberalized Cuba, you would get a bump on growth, this might be the evidence that you're looking for. Because this is the closest the United States has come inside my day. You'd have to go back to Jimmy Carter when there were really no restrictions on travel, but that was a different time. It was the middle of the Cold War. It's not like Cuba was a hot spot for vacationing back then for anybody. There were no Spaniards going there. There were no French. All right. All right. So here's the bottom line. Venezuela, in 2014, the oil price took a nosedive from 2014 to 2015. You just see Venezuela start pulling Cuba down. They just start pulling them down. It's like an anchor. And then you see COVID hit, and that's that. And then the Tarea Ordenamiento comes, and Venezuela disappears. It's very small. It neither hurts nor helps Cuba. And Russia, which is the rest of the world, but it is Russia. Russia has already given them debt forgiveness again, helps them. The recovery from COVID was a wind on the back of Cuba because they're insured from oil prices and they're getting the recovery from everything else. Just like in the United States, we all had this great growth last year, lots of jobs, but it's because we're coming from such a low point. But here is this otherwise bizarre and significant decline in growth that is occurring to bring this number to zero. But for the Tarea de Ordenamiento, they would have had very, very positive growth last year. Something on the order of, 3-4%, which is good for them. So this is why we say this is a self-inflicted wound. It's this residual here that is not helping. Let me give you two very quick counterfactuals that come from this. The first is, there are two things we can do to look at what Venezuela has done to Cuba. The first is to say, Venezuela has two problems. The first is, it deeply integrates with Cuba. So it'd be like if I tied myself to, I'm going to use Luis. If I tie myself to Luis, and he falls down, he's dragging me down. There are two things that happen there. The first is he fell down. And the second thing is I tied myself to him. This 6.6 is the pain that I get as Cuba from tying myself to him. Just if I hadn't tied myself to him and he fell down, I would be 6.6 bigger. 6.6% bigger cumulatively. You follow me? So tying myself was a big thing. Now, we go the other way. If he had not fallen down, if he had continued to grow, but I had been tied to him, I would be 30% bigger. And so the decline in Venezuela has been so steep that if they had just continued, by the way, Venezuela is not a fast-growing country. Even in the 90s, it was basically stationary, but they didn't take a nosedive the way they had. And so Luis's fall has been very strong. That's the end. So, bottom line, we see problems that in the data, but nonetheless, this seems to have been homegrown disaster for the Cubans. We are having issues with their external data, but we don't think it's valueless. We just think there are knock-on effects to interpreting data that goes from, 4 digits to 6 in some cases and things like that. And so we looked at the real GDP data, and we can see, we believe, as I mentioned, that this is really, when you get down, down to brass tacks, they've ignited this inflationary spiral inside Cuba, and it's because they refused to deal with the subsidy that was the coup in a lasting way. Instead, they just relabeled everything, and they are right back to where they started in August, but now with high inflation and higher inequality. So that's all we have. Thank you.
The first discussant will be Lorenzo Perez.
Okay. I think that Jose is first to be commended because he provides very detailed information from official sources of what were the measures taken on the dictadura ordenamiento, and also he attempted to explain a bit how the IMF evolved over 2 or 3 decades, the type of policy. So, and he actually documents that. But having said that, this paper to me presented a challenge, which is the dialogue between the lawyers and the economists. And I think that Jose's paper could be enriched in a number of ways if he actually explains a little bit more the economics of the matter. For example, when he talks about structural adjustment, IMF programs, he gives me the impression that you only take care of some policies if you want to make big structural adjustment in the economy. But my point is that really fiscal, monetary, exchange rate policies are part of the normal set of policies that any country has to face, whether it's imposing reforms or not. And most of the time when there is an imbalance in an economy, external or domestic, the macroeconomic policy has to be tightened, and that might actually create some problems, some suffering, but that's part of the daily work of any government in any part of the world. And I guess this idea, it gets a bit lost in the paper. For example, you might have a situation of a country that has an underfunded pension system, and Cuba is a very good example of that. Or you might have a problem that there is a highly subsidized public sector, the public enterprises, to different exchange rates or simply passing to them some covering their losses by printing money. And these are problems that need to be addressed at one point. And this is part of the daily work of macroeconomics, so this is not something very unique. Then, what Jose calls structural adjustment Cuban style, I don't think that he's sufficiently critical. I think Rafael the bottom line of Rafael's paper is that these were self-inflicted problems in 2021 because of the way they carry out the so-called ordenamiento. And I don't like in the paper sometimes he talks about the idea that the government might be able to still assign prices to reach equilibrium in different markets. I mean, when I hear this, I feel like yelling basta ya. Price controls do not work. Central planning or sectoral planning, assigning prices, it doesn't work, it has never worked anywhere. And this is something that we should really be assertive about it. Then nitpicking a bit on Jose, but other speakers is more, is the discussion whether it's a blockade or it's an embargo. A blockade to me is what happened, for example, in October 1962. when John Kennedy put the US Navy and told the Russians, you cannot pass, and we go to war if you try to breach this blockade. Something similar is happening in Ukraine and Russia when the Russian Navy right now is blockading the shipment of grain. They reached an agreement of passing Ukrainian ships through the sea over there. So that's really a blockade. The rest is an embargo. An embargo can be moral, can be useful, can be useless. The embargo of the United States to Cuba has been very soft in many ways. You know, there are exceptions, agricultural products, medicine. For many, if you want to get a part of something abroad and you're the Cuban government, you go to Panama or another friendly country and you get it. You can buy Coca-Cola in Cuba. And that's not the center from the embargo. So that's something that I would sort of disagree with Jose. I have a comment here that the monetary reform, ordenamiento, whatever you want to call it, yes, it has been a failure. Remember Raúl Castro, when he became president, remember that he first had the measure to reduce the size of the public sector employees, and he was only able to do half of that. And when he would talk about the two different exchange rates of the different monedas, as they call it, he would say that they needed allow some time for the public enterprises to adjust so they would have to face the real prices of what foreign exchange was worth. Raúl talked about this for 8-9 years, and he actually didn't pull the trigger. Finally, they pulled the trigger, but the public enterprises were not ready. So they continued to be subsidized. They didn't close public enterprises. And now, now they have different exchange rate again for public enterprises. So to me, that's very clear that this hasn't worked at all. I mean, you have the different exchange rate and you have more inflation. And then I don't know, Jose didn't really pursue this very clear in his presentation, but in the version of the paper I have, he asked the question, who is more culpable? The sanctions to Cuba or the internal policy? And to me, again, the sanctions surely hurt the Cuban economy, create additional costs, but you could take domestic policy measures and obtain a supply response and be very positive to Cuba. And they haven't done that. I mean, they actually took the hard measure of the devaluation, and by the way, it's one of the largest devaluations in Latin America or in the world. It's a huge devaluation. But they didn't allow the supply response. And to allow the supply response, you have to allow the private sector to react. So it's really, I mean, if we could take the Cuban authorities to a court where you can accuse them of malpractice in policy making, they will really be found guilty. Okay.
And
I give the easy part now to Luis Rafael's brilliant presentation.
the second discussant will be the economist with the world's best name, Luis.
We have double tocayos.
Yeah, exactly.
I should apologize in advance. I gave Luis about 30 seconds to review the paper.
Yes, I don't know where to start. I had a copy of the second part.
And he presented also
I presented the first part, which I hadn't seen. And so I should say, the second part I had was very preliminary too. So very, very preliminary. So
We're working right up to the deadline. We're trying to meet your expectations. It's not easy.
That's right. So it was difficult to follow at places. I'm not talking about the results. The economic results were clear, as you presented them in graphs and numbers. But the writing explaining that needed, of course, deep editing. But in any case, what you're trying to do, and the second paper was about the impact of the external shocks on the ordenamiento and also on the Cuban macroeconomy. That's a very tough talk, as Jose Almirón also mentioned. He was a little more skeptical, saying that structural programs cannot really be evaluated. They can. You can evaluate the impact of certain measures. The question is how to do that, and I'll get to that back. I mean, the approach here is to use real GDP data over time. Of course, that's the most aggregate possible approach, and you have no price effects. Of course, we deal with Venezuela. I remember at the IMF there was one of the first models done by this Iraqi economists, a famous model on Venezuela.
Right.
And this model, it was had a few equations, but it didn't have a price for oil. It was just a real model. Well, how can you do that? I mean, how can you model the Venezuelan economy unless you have the oil price? So you have to look at essentially at carrying values and tie it with the financial aspect of the economy, which includes very difficult, as Rafael says, because there's no data on the capital account, no data on financial flows, and some of these real phenomena do not make any sense unless you have a counterparty in financial flows. Take the relationship of Cuba and Venezuela. Well, what is it? The important thing is not oil, actually. The important thing are exports of Cuban services, because how are those being paid for? And are they being paid by using barter with oil? Is there a surplus? Cuba has had a very big surplus with Venezuela. If you look at the accounts, the national accounts, but how is that surplus transferred from Venezuela to Cuba? And is it just oil as payment? Or I think the evidence suggests that in 2009, 2012, Cuba was obtaining very large financial transfers from Venezuela. So the impact exceeded the real transaction, the real element, because at that time Venezuela was doing very well. They had a huge current account surplus and could transfer financial resources to Cuba, and that would have an impact. So now, having said this, if I get back to the first paper or the beginning of the presentation, I think you're teasing us with this new data. That's fascinating. I mean, the chart you showed showing the relationship between the code depreciation and megawatt loss is very interesting. I mean, one can just begin to speculate what that means. Is it because, it's just very interesting. Okay, now talking about the data, several parts in both papers, you talk about this question of the devaluation impact on the fiscal balance. Cuba does have a big service surplus, export to services surplus, but it has a huge, of course, deficit in goods. And the net effect, we don't really know what the real foreign currency budget of the government is. We don't have that data, but we can infer from the national accounts, for instance. I get the number I think you get 4 billion current account deficit. If you look at the balance on goods and services, it's minus 2.7 or something like this, 2.3, minus 2.3. So it's in the ballpark. It's a big. That suggests there was a big deficit in the government's foreign currency fiscal balance. Now, in Venezuela, by the way, and I think the relationship in Venezuela is very interesting. Venezuela, they always devalued to fund their fiscal deficit because they had a huge foreign currency surplus on the Venezuelan fiscal position, so that every time they devalue, they get, at the new exchange rate, they get a huge surplus. But Cuba has very likely a deficit in the foreign currency position, so the devaluation, in that sense, made that part of the fiscal position worse off. Now, how is it financed? Well, that's another question for another day. So, okay, so now the general approach of the second paper about looking at the shocks is very interesting, and I think it serves as a model for work we can do about Cuba in terms of analyzing, decomposing the changes, using the variable coefficients is very, very good. But one question about Cuba, if you look at whatever long-term trend you see, is that this place has had a lot of structural changes. I think you identified two when you're doing the analysis, but you know, there are all kinds of things that are happening in Cuba that we could quantify. And that makes it difficult to use the methodology. You mentioned the 2004, I thought about the same thing. You know, in 2004 they changed the, I think Jorge Perez Lopez wrote a paper about this, when they began to measure services differently, and there's a big jump in all the data, and that's certainly structural change. So there are many different kinds of structural change, and so it's difficult to use, I think, use the bi-parent methodology to look at this. But you know, if you have too many structural changes, then this is very difficult to identify them precisely and how to differentiate them over time. Now, what about the results at the end of your talk? Now, I think the approach you take using just long-term GDP data gives you information. And I think basically what Vanessa and I were talking about is the science certainly appear very, very convincing, the science, but what about the meaning of the numbers? And it's very difficult to distill precise information from just looking at the relationship between GDPs, even as you decompose them. Now, one alternative approach, which there's a lot of work that has been done, both on Russian impact and on the impact of Venezuela on Cuba, is to look at what is the grant component of the trade between the two countries. How much is it comes out from the sky? It's just a gift. And you know, we know about Russia a lot because the CIA did a very detailed study going back to the 1960s up to 1995 or something, 1993. And they look at the grant component of, this is also being made public, by the way, you can get it on the internet. And they measure year by year the grant component of Russian Cuba trade. And you know, at the peak year, this was about 27% of GDP. So that Russia was granting Cuba the equivalent of 27% of Cuba's GDP. Now, that's a staggering number. And actually very little bit, but it was usually in the 20s. I mean, it declined, I think the peak year was in 1981 or 82, 27, then it went down 24, 23, but it was very high, over 20%, over a significant period of time. But when you look at Venezuela, the same story, same kind of analysis, you look at the grant component of Venezuelan Cuban trade, and I think Ernesto Hernandez-Calá looked at this, we both looked at it, and I think the big number we get is about 6% of GDP. In other words, the top, is a little bit less than 6% of GDP, the top grant component of the trade. There's a grant. Why is there a grant? Well, the reason is that when you look at the Cuban numbers, again, the key thing are these doctors and spies, whatever Cuba sends to Venezuela, and they're paid very high salaries. When you look at the numbers, we don't know precisely the number, but we know the range. The annual salaries are very, very high. And when you look at what comparable market price would be for a Cuban doctor, for instance, by looking at Brazilian salaries, there's a huge difference in the salary that Venezuela was paying implicitly and what Brazilian paid doctors, so that is a huge grant component. And well, in any case, in the Venezuelan case, the peak is a little bit less than 6% of GDP. So that, which is very high, right? In other words, getting 5.7% of GDP. So what happens essentially, this peaked around 2013. And so what we have now until ordenamiento is that this 6% went essentially to basically zero. But the interesting thing, and this is the comparison, I compared this data of the grant transfer with the result you put here, the main result. And the main difference is that when you look at this grant element, is that it's pretty steady, at a little bit less than 6%, 5%, 5.5% until 2018, and then it dropped 2019 drastically. I mean, you show that pattern, but you have a gradual decline using just the real sector numbers. And again, part of the effect is the price effect. That you have the oil price moved a lot during that period. But I think the main point is that your results make sense. They have the right direction, and now you can as to what the difference, whether they grew at 1.8% or 1.3%. Well, I think you cannot really be that precise with that kind of data. Now, what can one do from this approach? I think the approach is very interesting, and many things you can do. Beginning here is a very good start, and I always like to look at consumption rather than just GDP, because at the end of the day, that's really what counts. And there is consumption data in Cuba. Now, another point is about inflation in Cuba and the ordenamiento impact. Now, people who've looked, some of us have looked at this, and we were puzzled why inflation is only 78%. The numbers don't add up, because you have a 33% devaluation of the official rate from 1 to 24. Yeah, 1 minute, yeah. And you have 33% devaluation, and you get 78% inflation. It's not possible, because when an imported good gets to the airport in Havana, it's 23% more expensive. Not only 78%. But if you look at the national accounts were just published, the deflator inflation is 430%. So that's pretty much agrees with calculations some of us have made. And the deflator, of course, is not exactly comparable because it's an average, yearly average. But the difference between 78 and 430, what is it? Well, it's subsidies. I mean, implicit subsidies built up in the system. It's a huge distortion. And that is, of course, corresponds to the fiscal deficit. And it has to be financed. And that is why it's not working, because that reflects on the companies. State companies are operating in a system where there is a huge distortion between the cost of inputs and what people are getting. So, in any case, it's very interesting and a good start. Thank you very much.
We don't have very much time left, but I think maybe if the speakers want to make any comments on.
Very briefly, Lorenzo was way too kind, way too easy on me. He said many important things. You're right. I think that the U.S. sanctions are the proximate cause, 51%, because I think the consensus measure is that the U.S. market is 80% of Cuba's natural export and import market. Take that away from a country, how could that not be relevant? And about the blockade question, it took me 15 years to get there. I didn't conclude that it was a blockade until about 3 years ago. I wrote an article about it that defends Cuba's embargo claim against the US. And you're absolutely right, not critical enough, absolutely right. It would benefit from development structural, absolutely right. And I really liked your your formulation. In terms of price discovery, they don't want open market price discovery. I mean, they want state-based price formation with a little, maybe not an invisible hand, like an invisible pinky or something. You know, I think in terms of like, Keynes' animal spirits, not bears, maybe very small animals that are motivated. And you know, what you said about lawyers and economists, I really appreciated that. I wish we had more time to talk about that because I think that's very relevant to ASCE. And I think, you know, as a lawyer, I'm concerned about normativity, much more concerned about norms, and I think that's why these are two mutually enriching dialogues. And I just wanted to say that, you know, in terms of economics, there are two ways of doing research. Merton Miller got a Nobel Prize. He's associated with something called the Miller-Modigliani capital irrelevance theorem, and he comes up with this brilliant analysis, and he says, well, assume white taxes, assume white transaction costs, assume perfect information, okay, and here's my conclusions. And he does that. A couple of years later, Ronald Coase got the Nobel Prize, and he has a very different approach to economics. He's like, you know, I'm not focused on the reality of the model. I want to know, is it a model of reality? And obviously, I think as a qualitative person, I couldn't begin to understand all the statistical things you talked about. So anyway, I'd like to go on, but it's just a very good, you know, wonderful reactions thing.
Rafael, you want to?
No, thank you, Luis, for your excellent comments. I think you're right. We don't have prices in here. We just have an issue with the data right now, and we will do more with price data as it comes in. So I take your point. You are correct. More needs to be done in that direction. And then there are a lot of surprising things that we're finding in these data, megawatt, and the fact that Venezuela was not a factor, et cetera, et cetera. So we're working on this. Right now, the only thing that we can rely on is GDP data until we fully understand where they're going to land. Because this is also, you have to understand from our perspective, this is also a moving target in the sense that one day all you worry about is the parallel market. This next day, now you have two official rates, etc. So we don't even know what we're modeling at this point. But all of your points are well taken.
Okay, I know we only have a few minutes, so okay, I'll open up for a few questions, but I do want to make a couple of comments myself. Go ahead.
Yes.
Roger.
On Rafael's paper, you started your presentation by saying that basically the unification was a mechanism to subsidize somebody or to eliminate the subsidies that did not eliminate the subsidies. What they ended up doing was continuing. And so my way of following up with suggestions that this is an opening for further research is to try to identify the main sectors that got the subsidies. And if your analysis is correct, then that should also show up in the data. And so if you want to make your cases more strongly, then you want to follow from that perspective. Those sectors are easy to identify. Any domestic sector that didn't have direct access to workers.
I just want to sort of take a stab at trying to clarify something that's very difficult and very complicated to try to sort out. It has to do with the relationship to lawyers and economists. And I think the debate that Lorenzo that Jose are having in terms of sort of the question about the economy, and it's a really deep topic, like the core of classical economics and sort of the supply to demand thing, price discovery, and sort of the real. And I don't have really any solution to it except to try to explain why there's this disagreement. And I think that for people that see from the legal perspective, all of that mechanisms that will ultimately create the price discovery is based on institutions. And it has to go work through them. So who sets the price? Well, companies. And how is the company put together? Will it have shareholders? And there's a separation between ownership and control. and then they're the board, and they're actually not really responsible to many people, because you can't, the shareholder group is very much green. And many times what the executives get, excessive pay, and there's no real remedy to that. And then they said the prices to make the most of the shareholders would not take into account anything else. You see the supply of oil going up, but the price not going down. Right, so in other words, we see actually many aspects of the institutions and how the rules are set up. There's going to be impunity to act in non-economic ways, right? Self-serving ways, self-interested ways. And so that really then kind of demystifies the whole thing, that really is how it's operated. It's not a picture of reality. There isn't, because it has to be filtered through all these institutions that are based on legal rules, and the legal rules are a product of a lot of rent seeking and a lot of impunity. And so that's an idealized model that doesn't exist in our world either. So then why quibble with, okay, if you want to rearrange it a little bit in some other way, maybe that's not possible. But it seems like if you believe in this empirical, from the lawyerly perspective, I guess, empirical about institutions, to maintain that fiction about the supply and demand and increasing price means you're a person that's willing to tolerate all the excesses of rent seeking in the way that we have, and sort of the highest prices possible to the extent that people that absolutely need it will pay for it because they have to eat, and then it will just create extreme inequality because the system can. Anyway, just to try to clarify why I think that there's this difference in perspective.
Okay, I'm going to have the last word then. I actually disagree with probably 99% of what was just said. I think it's the opposite. But in any case, thank you very much for attending today. And well, that's it.
Quick point here. We didn't do it this year, but the last time we met on our strategy, we had a field guide that said if you essentially said if you're a new person, you're exempt, so that you can break into any conversation, introduce yourself, and but we don't like to make that offer to everybody here. Please see if people standing around talking. Go in and introduce yourself and break in. ASCE is very much a congenial organization. It's the same, it's kind of thing, same time, same place next year, moving. And those friendships are very important. So please take the opportunity. Thank you.
You're too nice for them, so people only use masks, and I know that.
Railroads can figure 10%, so you take it out with 10%, you lose only the same.
Let's say
No, Yeah, both effects. They have both. They started in South, sorry, garbage. And, there's no help to the camera, so you can't really okay. So you can't leave. Well, this is why nobody up. So I can go and just do like this. I know what we'll do is session, then I make sure mine works and then we're maybe she worked. So be I'm telling you, believe me, I know that when, as soon as I saw you, I go, oh no, this might be a problem. I haven't traveled in so long. 18 months. They both do. Yeah. Good job. ¿Qué te pareció? No puede yo. Es espectacular, puede ser. Pero un juego, pero ¿quién puede probar? Muchas cosas, ¿no? Sobre la liquidez del mercado. como los dos like que pasan para eso, el riesgo que hay, el riesgo de mercado, puede ser ilegal, ¿no? No se pensaría que el micrófono debe ser para cubrir el riesgo que hay. Por eso cuando están en serio, si lo hacen, siempre me ha parecido que es demasiado trabajo.
It's the most mental.
Yeah, I feel
Yo creo que
nosotros no hemos podido captar. Tiene que hacerle
I disagree. What happened?
almeno un volumen de mensajes.
So I think they
Pero para la gente interesada en el tema ¿qué información se puede ¿qué es relevante en ese sentido contenido bueno, yo creo que
Well, that's a generic, yeah, that's
No, porque tampoco es y eso no cambiaron. Esa evaluación no produce ese efecto en la economía real que debería poder producir. Y lo otro en la data de 24 eso no dejaba, no tenía que ser 24. Si hubiera tenido esa tasa de cada total, hubiera tenido no, y ya lo había, de hecho, el evaluar mucho más de la pandemia, pero estaba a 40 en el 2019. Como dije, poner otro número ya. Los tipos de esa él lo decía de una manera en términos de lo que debería pasar. Y nosotros decíamos, pero aún no pensar, no hay una formación transcultural para juntos. Entonces, ¿cómo va a decir que eso es lo que debe pasar? Y es lo que vemos que en la realidad eso no va a pasar. No va a haber. Como efectivamente, no ocurre. Eso es algo que no hace.
Okay, we're just waiting for a couple of seconds for the ASCE folks that are still out there in the break. They're slowly wandering in. Just give them maybe 1 more minute and then we'll start.
I'll go again.
Thank you. Okay, folks, welcome back. Welcome back to our afternoon panel. In large part, I'm really happy to be moderating this panel. This is probably kind of like the centerpiece, I would say, of the colloquium of the symposium, because all along we really have wanted to talk about issues about the environment, climate change, environmental topics, and how that affects Cuba as well. So, as you know, this conference is much more than that, right? So many other legal issues, economic, it's very interdisciplinary. We have scholars, from all different fields, working on different topics. But there's sort of a special place in the Symposium for Environmental Law. And we're really happy to be welcoming the panelists that we have. I'll introduce them in a minute. But before I do that, I just wanted to say a couple of things. Generally, since this is a plenary, I did want to take the time, didn't have a chance before at the beginning, to thank the president of ASCE, Gary Maybardu, who's poured his heart and soul really into organizing this and making sure everything comes and getting it all organized and finding a good venue for it, like FIU Law. and having you all here. And he's our outgoing president. I just wanted to recognize him for a second.
I think I lost myself in the process.
The other thing is that I wanted to mention is about the FIU Law Review. So as you know, this is a collaboration with the ASCE, that's an association that's been around for a long time, and the FIU Law Review that publishes legal articles. And we've invited a number of people to contribute pieces, essays for the next issue of the Law Review specifically, but also for any of the panelists that have come today and have presented. If you have a paper that you'd like to submit to the Law Review for consideration to be published in this issue, this special issue that we're doing on Cuba, please submit it to us. You can come talk to me or to Carla Rivas that you met this morning and talk to her about it. It can be an interdisciplinary paper, but of course they would have to review it and to make sure it fits the parameters for a law journal article. But they have a great staff and they'll be willing to help you put it together so it can be part of that issue. So if you're at all interested in that, come talk to Carla or to myself and see if we can get that put together. Okay, so we have a stellar panel, and I'd just like to briefly introduce and then give them the word, so not to have me do all the talking. As you know from this morning, I'm Professor Jorge Esquirol, I teach here at FIU, and we have two main panelists that are going to be speaking to you about environmental law and regulation in the Cuban context. One we're thrilled to have here at the invitation of ASCE, Professor Daimar Canovas from the University of Havana Law School, who's a professor of environmental law as well as some other topics, and the editor of one of the law reviews focused on environmental issues in Cuba. Our other special guest is Professor Berta Hernandez-Puyol from the University of Florida College of Law in Gainesville, an authority on all things Cuban, international, and basically having to do with theory and critical theory as well. We're delighted to have her here focused on the environmental question in Cuba. We also have a couple of discussants. We have Maria Dolores Espino, who is a professor of economics, now retired from St. Thomas University here in the area. And joining us is also Professor Silvia Pedraza from the University of Michigan, sociologist who needs no introduction, very familiar with ASCE, a key pillar of the association that's maintained for so many years and past president of ASCE as well. Okay, without further ado, we are going to have Professor Canovas begin.
Muchas gracias por la oportunidad de estar acá.
Thank you for the opportunity for being here today.
Sé el esfuerzo que hicieron para que eso fuera posible.
I know it was a great effort for me to be here today.
Y gracias también a Alicia que me va a ayudar con la interpretación.
And thank you to Lipsia, who's going to be doing some other interpretation.
La pretensión de la exposición es, como su nombre lo indica, dar una panorámica general del derecho ambiental cubano.
And so what we're going to be discussing today, as you can see in the presentation, is present and future of environmental law in Cuba.
Y partiríamos de cuál ha sido la evolución del marco institucional, de cómo se ha organizado la administración pública en Cuba para enfrentar los problemas ambientales.
So we're going to be discussing how the framework in Cuba has broken these issues down.
Fundamentalmente, habría que partir después del año 1976, los asuntos ambientales quedaron bajo un Comité Estatal de Ciencia y Tecnología, así se llamaban en aquel entonces.
So back then, as of 1976, they created a committee called the State of Science and Technology Committee for these issues.
Cuestión que después ha resultado ser positiva porque la unión de la ciencia y el ambiente se ha mantenido en la administración pública cubana. De hecho, la autoridad ambiental se llama Ministerio de Ciencia, Tecnología y Medio Ambiente desde el año 1994.
So as of 1994, they maintained these issues and they were able to create the Ministry of Science and Technology and Environment.
Por el camino hubo unos intentos de organizar unas especies de comisiones, de conferencias.
Along the way, they tried to organize this through commissions and conferences
Que reuniera a los distintos organismos con competencias en determinados recursos naturales y eso no fructificó, de hecho llevó a un cambio institucional.
So they were trying to merge something along with natural resources, but it did not seem to work out.
Desde el punto de vista legal, la primera ley ambiental cubana, aunque no con ese nombre, es la ley 33 del año 1981, una ley que recogía principios básicos de la protección ambiental.
So we have Law 33, which is not exactly the name, but it essentially helped us create a legal framework for some environmental issues.
Y que fue sustituida en el año 1997 por la ley 81, vigente hasta este año 2022.
And that law was replaced by Law 81, the Law of Environment 1997, that is still in effect as of now.
De hecho, la nueva ley del Sistema de los Recursos Naturales y Medio Ambiente fue aprobada el 14 de mayo y todavía no ha entrado en vigor, o sea, la ley 81 está vigente aún porque no ha sido publicada en la Gaceta Oficial.
So we do have a new law that has come to pass, but it's not effective yet.
De estas dos breves reseñas históricas, hay algunas características entonces del derecho ambiental cubano que las vamos a extraer y vamos a ver cómo después se problematizan, ¿no? En primer lugar, a pesar de la existencia de un Ministerio de Ciencia, Tecnología y Medio Ambiente, hay otros organismos con competencia en determinados recursos naturales.
Even though we do have a Ministry of Science, there are other organisms that do help with environmental law and issues.
Por tanto, la competencia de ese Ministerio del Ambiente, digamos que no es plena. Hay organismos como el Instituto de Recursos Hidráulicos, el Ministerio de Agricultura.
So we have other organizations like the Administration of Agriculture Services.
Agricultura, por ejemplo, tiene competencia sobre suelo, bosques, flora y fauna silvestre.
And they're in charge of flora and forests.
Es una cuestión de difícil administración bajo esa división de las competencias, de las atribuciones. Piensen cuán difícil puede ser que la jurisdicción o la competencia sobre la flora y fauna esté en el Ministerio de Agricultura y la de la biodiversidad en otro organismo.
So just imagine some organizations are in charge of the flora, and then there's another organizations that are in charge of biodiversity, and so merging those two topics together makes it hard to administer some of the legal framework on these issues.
Y al mismo tiempo la ley 81 ha tenido un carácter de ley MAC que tiene que ser complementada con una serie de disposiciones complementarias.
So Law 81 has a series of other laws that need to complement it in itself in order for it to function properly.
Complementarias, pero que contradictoriamente han tenido a veces el mismo rango que la propia ley. Dígase, por ejemplo, la ley de aguas y la ley de forestal, digamos.
So it kind of contradicts itself with the law of water and the forest law as well. It's almost like a contradictory issue that they have in place.
De ahí que yo creo que se viene trabajando en una nueva ley que sustituya precisamente la vigente desde hace unos 15 años, por supuesto con más intensidad en los últimos 2 años. Y
so now we have a new law that's been in effect that might be more purposeful than the last law that we had in place for environmental issues.
La presentación lo que tiene es una serie de cuestiones en este caso que debían ser resueltas por la nueva ley porque de hecho son deficiencias tanto en el diseño como en la aplicación de la ley vigente.
So there are some deficiencies in this law and it should fix the problem, but we're not sure if that's going to happen exactly.
Por ejemplo, citar solo algunos y no extenderme demasiado. La ley 81 es lo que nosotros llamamos una ley demasiado declarativa de muchos principios. ¿Ah?
Law 81 seems to be a law that's with many principles, almost declarative.
Pero que le cuesta trabajo desarrollar esos principios, o sea, ser más prescriptiva, más reglamentaria.
But it has
Sí, que o sea, es muy declarativa la ley y no desarrolla las instituciones, se quedan en los meros principios.
Well, it doesn't develop, it stays almost stagnant, it doesn't develop itself.
Desde el punto de vista institucional, mencionaba el caso del Ministerio de Agricultura, porque se da una dualidad ahí. Pongo la expresión porque es común entre nosotros de ser juez parte al mismo tiempo. Porque el Ministerio de Agricultura es el que está encargado de explotar el recurso y al mismo tiempo la ley le encomienda protegerlo desde el punto de vista ambiental. Y eso evidentemente es una debilidad.
So there's a weakness in the law that the Ministry of Agriculture is meant to protect, but it also exploits at the same time the environment.
Muchas veces instituciones han estado enunciadas en la ley y la propia administración pública no ha desarrollado reglamentariamente la institución. Desde que se promulgó la ley 81 en el año 97 hay, por ejemplo, previsto un seguro ambiental obligatorio y la reglamentación de ese seguro ambiental obligatorio no ha aparecido.
Okay, so as of law, sorry.
Sí, otras instituciones que la ley no ha desarrollado pueden ser el seguro ambiental obligatorio, la evaluación de impacto ambiental.
Yes. So other aspects that the law has not developed is like a sort of an environmental insurance, and a regulatory pact. So these are all institutions that kind of are in co-ed, that the law kind of foresees but haven't been developed or implemented.
E igualmente hay temas importantísimos en el debate ambiental de hoy, como el cambio climático, que ni siquiera tienen una mención en la ley ambiental.
There are important topics like climate change that are not even mentioned once in the law.
Lo que se ha hecho en cambio climático hasta hoy ha sido desde la política pública, no desde la administración.
What's been done in the environmental area to this day is from sort of public policy perspective, not from the perspective of growing out of the legislation itself.
De ahí que la necesidad de la nueva ley y sobre todo a partir del año 2019, si digo 2019 ha tenido un impulso significativo con la aprobación del nuevo texto constitucional que reconoce a ese nivel por primera vez el derecho a un medio ambiente sano y equilibrado.
So the law from 1997 was deficient in all these ways, right? It provided for a number of things that weren't implemented, institutions that weren't developed, and there was a need for a new law, which is what was just passed, and that was propelled by the Constitutional Convention of 2019 as well.
Sobre todo porque éramos conscientes de que de nada valía tener en la Constitución el reconocimiento de ese derecho si después digamos que las facultades que le eran inherentes, como el acceso a la información ambiental, la participación pública en la toma de decisiones y el acceso a la justicia, después no se implementaban.
Because it was seen it would be a dead letter if it just appeared in the Constitution, just to have a right to the environment generally without the development of all the subsidiary rights, like right to information, right to, what were the other rights? Información, ¿qué más?
Información, participación pública y acceso.
Y acceso
a la justicia.
Public participate, right to information, public participation, and access to justice, meaning causes of action.
En el caso de la garantía de todo ese andamiaje, que eran los sistemas de responsabilidad, teníamos, por ejemplo, un código penal que no contemplaba para nada delitos ambientales.
Existing in terms of legal remedies, for example, criminal code didn't provide for environmental crimes.
Y en materia de responsabilidad civil por el daño ambiental, se conocían en unas salas de justicia que se conoce como salas de lo económico, y tuvimos muy pocos casos. O sea, en realidad, en cuestión de 20 años, no pasarían de 30 los casos que llegaron a los tribunales en materia ambiental.
Casos individuales.
Sí, de reclamaciones individuales.
The other possibility in terms of legal redress is civil responsibility, like a tort action, an individual tort action. And those were not very many of them. There was a special court for them. And in the period that we were considering, since the law of 1997, as far as DMR knows, there were only about 30 cases brought.
Entonces, justamente la ley nueva del sistema de los recursos naturales y medio ambiente, del cual nada más voy a hacer referencia a algunas cuestiones, busca trabajar sobre esos aspectos o esas deficiencias que se habían detectado en primer lugar. Hay reconocimiento a nuevos principios en materia de protección ambiental, y hay uno que es significativo. En el paper está desarrollado algunos de ellos, pero sobre todo el principio de no regresión en materia ambiental.
So the law was meant to address these areas of deficiency, essentially. It's non-implementation, non-institutionalization, the inability of individuals to pursue others for this type of environmental harm. And the new law also includes new principles. A significant one is the principle of non-regression, and that means actually when you're moving forward in terms of individual rights and the like, that the courts won't go, or the legislation won't go backwards. There won't be a reduction. The society is always evolving forward, and it would be a constitutional violation actually to reverse and go back in terms of protection.
Igualmente, en la parte institucional aparece un sistema de los recursos naturales y el medio ambiente que integre el Ministerio de Ciencia, Tecnología y Medio Ambiente como organismo rector y el resto de los organismos que tienen control sobre determinados recursos.
And the institutional structure has also been reformed so that the ministry itself, the Ministry of Science, Technology, and the Environment, is the umbrella organization that oversees all the separate legislation, like he described before, water legislation, forest legislation, that it was all in different institutions and being overseen by different institutions. The ministry is the one now overseeing everything.
Hay una serie de instrumentos de gestión que o se desarrollan de otra manera o se introducen por primera vez en la ley. Estamos hablando de la evaluación ambiental estratégica, porque la ley cubana se quedaba en la evaluación de los impactos ambientales de un proyecto concreto, no evaluaba los planes o los programas de desarrollo como un todo, y este instrumento va dirigido a ello.
We've also developed additional instruments within the law, like the strategic environmental evaluation that goes beyond the strategic environmental plan, in that the strategic environmental, or the environmental impact plan, which I think you may have heard of, in the US we do that too, environmental impact, in terms of when projects are built and things like that. So this is a more comprehensive, takes into account more considerations.
Igual se regula un sistema nacional de información ambiental disponiendo no solo la periodicidad, la obligación periódica que tiene el Estado de dar información ambiental general, sino regulando un procedimiento individual de solicitud de información ambiental, plazos, límites para ese derecho.
Por parte de cualquiera.
Sí.
And setting up a national information outpost or office in which the government is required to provide periodic information upon request by anybody.
El Código Penal nuevo, que ha sido tan comentado por otras cuestiones, tiene también un título específico de delitos contra el ambiente y los recursos naturales, donde se incluye delitos de contaminación de agua, contaminación atmosférica, ataques a la diversidad biológica. Es importante este aspecto de la diversidad biológica porque es una digamos que de las ilegalidades que más se da, el ataque a la fauna silvestre, ligada por supuesto a un comercio ilícito.
Especie en vía de extinción.
Puede ser alguna o endémica.
The criminal code also, there's been environmental crime added that provides for sanctions for pollution of water, air water pollution, also attacks on biodiversity for species in extinction or endemic species as well.
Y además una serie de reglas que tienden a facilitar el acceso a la justicia ambiental en las salas en este caso salas de lo mercantil, de lo administrativo, es la sala competente desde este año 2022. Reglas como la ampliación de la legitimación de cualquier persona interesada puede iniciar un proceso. No tiene que estar personalmente dañado.
And expansion of access to justice in the area of environmental law, in which a proceeding has been established through the administrative justice system, administrative law, in which standing has been expanded beyond the state. Again, standing open to private individuals.
Reglas sobre la posibilidad de que la autoridad, por ejemplo, adopte medidas cautelares de oficio, sin que se lo pida el actor, de invertir o disponer libremente de la carga de la prueba según el sujeto que más condiciones económicas tenga para probar.
So, also the power has been given to the courts sua sponte to issue a preliminary injunction in case of ongoing environmental damage. And they have changed the burdens of proof of who's required to bring proof of the environmental harm in this dynamic burden of proof idea that whoever has most access to the evidence is the one that has the burden of production.
Y precisamente estos son algunos de los aspectos que tiene la nueva ley. Creo que hacer un juicio sobre ella si todavía están publicadas sería demasiado apresurado. Habría que esperar algunos años para ver en qué medida ese diseño legislativo fue efectivo o no.
And it's true, the law still hasn't come out, and it's not effective yet, it's available, it's not effective yet, so it's too early to tell what the balance is in terms of its.
En algunos aspectos, digo en lo personal, se quedó a medio camino de la solución ideal, ¿no? Todos queríamos, por ejemplo, a lo mejor una administración ambiental más fuerte, no que compartiera la administración de los recursos naturales, pero al menos se dio un paso de avance.
So it is too early to evaluate it, and for many of us, it only went halfway, it didn't meet all the objectives we wanted, but step forward. Muchas gracias. Now we have Professor Hernandez Toyota.
Buenas tardes. I cannot talk sitting down. I cannot sit and think at the same time, so I am coming up here. I also do not have diapositivas for you. That all notwithstanding, it is a huge pleasure and an honor to be here today. I want to thank my dear friend, I think, Jorge Esquirol, as well as ASCE, for inviting me to be part of this exciting conference. When Jorge invited me to participate, he noted that the theme is Cuban environmental law. Well, I am a human rights person, so I was hugely comforted when he said it's environment in a broad framework. To be sure, the environment is a broad and complex concept. For example, in international human rights, the idea of a right to a healthy environment is an emerging collective right. Its foundation lies in, among other rights, the right to health, which in turn includes the rights to physical and mental health. Regardless of perspective, the concept of the environment is inextricably intertwined with people. Nonetheless, discussions on environmental law often focus on the tangible, lowering lead exposure of children, improving health of water tables, preserving a limited resource. In the context of Cuba, conversations around the environment invariably highlight the environmental preservation brought about by the revolution. Cuban laws, as Daimar has presented, very deeply protect the environment. As I already confessed, I'm not an environmental law expert, so I have taken the liberty to play a bit with the concept of environment and posit that equally as important to conversations around the environment regarding Cuba is what I've coined the human environment, the elements that create the atmosphere in which Cuban people live their daily lives. I title my talk, because I have to give a title so I can figure out what I'm going to say, Cuba's Human Environment, Government, Culture, and People. As the title intimates, I envision there are three constitutive parts central to the human environment. The government, which establishes the frame for the lived environment. La cultura cubana, which provides color or patina to the frame. And la gente cubana, who perform the lived environment. I will talk about each of these factors as they provide the anchor to explore the complexity of Cuban civil society's relation with the political and cultural environment in La Isla and their connection to existing human rights. I first turn to the government as it historically has had a lasting impact on culture and people. In any given geography, governments have a huge impact on the human environment, as governments frame the landscape for human existence. Indeed, government's creation of norms, establishment of policies, and engagement in political rhetoric set the stage for human beings' lived lives. In international human rights, just like there is an emerging right to healthy environment, there is also an emerging right to democratic governance, which in contrast to environmental protection is not salient in Cuban laws. Like the right to a healthy environment, the right to democratic governance is based on the people's right to participate in government, and health, ultimately, a people's right. A brief look at Cuba's governance from conquest and colonization to independence to the present provides insight into both government's failures and the people's insistence on their rights. Before colonization, Hinducuanas y Cubanos peacefully inhabited the island. A mere 30 years after the Spaniards' arrival, the population was decimated. Having lost a workforce, enslaved persons from Africa were brought to the island to provide labor. 3 centuries of Spanish invasion and colonization established a Cuban society in which Spanish culture, institutions, including religion, and language prevailed. One Spanish institution that has survived through the ages is a caste system, hierarchically categorizing individuals in social, economic, educational, and racial factors. Established castes notwithstanding, the criollos developed an ingenious business class. With the collapse of Haiti as a sugar-producing colony, led a sugar revolution that transformed Cuba to a major sugar producer. The criollos, however, were in rivalry with Spain for governing the island. And when that relationship became tense, the United States got involved. The criollos' desire for independence from Spain culminated in a war. That, of course, we all know, involved all 3 parties. And the conflict was resolved before the Cubans, the Cuban independent fighters, could claim victory, which set up a different dynamic of power confirmed by the Treaty of Paris, in which Spain and the US decided on Cuba's future without letting Cuba even take part. And then came Platismo, and after the end of Platismo, the US maintained much control over the successive Cuban governments, interfering when its interests were at risk. Cuba had more than its fair share of political instability, but instability notwithstanding, the 1940 Constitution was noteworthy. It was progressive and articulated individual rights. It predated and prognosticated the post-World War II era of human rights development. Amid the politically volatile climate, an anti-US revolutionary seized power after successful revolt against Batista. And after years of occupation, the population was ripe for liberation. He inspired the subjugated, Afro-descendants, Indian persons, women, the poor, the rural, who were all ready for full citizenship and true independence from Spain, from the US, and from the elite. Castro's revolution fueled the deep nationalistic feelings of the Cuban people and provided hope and inspiration to those oppressed by strong powers around the world. Many, including the United States, initially supported Castro, but soon rejected his socialist and communist ideology. The US imposed the embargo, broke diplomatic relations, and between the embargo and the subsequent Helms-Burton, it has created a source of energy for the island's government to unify the people against the northern hegemon. Inspirational rhetoric notwithstanding, the government has a pretty bad record, the Cuban government, of human rights violations, ranging from economic matters such as nationalizations to mistreatment of prisoners, abridgment of free speech and association, lack of due process, non-existence of a free press, lack of ability to participate meaningfully in government, and the right to travel, that hugely affect the human environment. To be sure, Cuba claims that the violations of human rights are against it, and that those violations against it have deteriorated the human environment. The blockade, as Cuba prefers to name it, with its extraterritorial reach, a reach that does in fact violate international law, denies Cuba the right to self-determination, travels on sovereignty, and results in deprivation of health, tourism, and trade. Outside narratives provide insight to Cuba's human rights reality. The 2020 Human Development Report labels Cuba a state with high human development, with its performance in health and education rivaling industrial states. In contrast, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Freedom House, in their 2022 reports, condemn Cuba's record on political and civil rights, including harassment and detention of political dissidents and other lacks of freedoms. Reports of the Comisión Cubana de Derechos Humanos y Reconciliación Nacional, an illegal, according to Cuban laws, Cuban NGO that specializes in human rights, confirms this litany of wrongs. Since the discovery of the island, the human environment created by governments has not promoted human well-being. Conditions of oppression imposed by successive governments have not respected the right of participation, have set the meta stage, what I call the frame, for Cuba's human environment, one in which the people do not enjoy human rights. The second significant element of filling in the hues of the human environment is culture. To be sure, there's a human right to cultural expression, but that right is a shield from outsider intrusion on culture, not a sword to deny people's human rights. The concept of Cuban culture is foundational to understanding life in Cuban society. Like government, culture affects people's lives. As government does with legal rules, culture, by imposing social norms, permeates all aspects of civil society. To be sure, culture is also embedded in government, as governmental actors are imbued in and thus perform duties within the shading of cultural tropes. Cultural tropes on race, sex, and sexuality embedded in the structures of government and society alike permeate daily life. These cultural tropes evince paradoxes, a disjunction between the reality of race, sex, gender, and sexuality inequality and the laws, both Cubans and international human rights equality mandates. Other social structures, family, work, and politics also reflect racial, gendered, and sexuality inequities that have subordinating consequences. Traditional race attitudes in Cuba are hierarchical and inherited from Spanish culture. The concept of race, however, because most Cubans are of racial admixtures, has developed as a fluid continuum. But the preferred ethnic cultural self-identification does not mean that there are no racial barriers. By the time of the War of Independence, Afro-Cubans were no longer enslaved, but they were neither politically nor socially integrated within broader Cuban society. While José Martí believed Afro-Cubans' participation in the war effort would translate to equality, racial distinctions persisted after independence. In 1912, Afro-Cubans formed the Partido Independiente de Color to protest disparate treatment in employment. The Cuban government, with the aid of US Marines, violently crushed the rebellion. Notwithstanding Afro-Cubans' contribution to society, they remained second-class citizens. After the revolution, the Marxist perspective believed that discrimination was rooted in class. That notwithstanding, the gains by the revolution in health and education reflected with Afro-Cuban society are not paralleled in the economic sector. There are two reasons. Perhaps Afro-Cubans have less people sending money into the island, and two, the racial hierarchy established by Spain means that they don't get the sexy jobs in tourism and so forth. Beyond the inherited racial hierarchies, Cuban culture has internalized sex-based hierarchies as well. Octavio Paz in El laberinto de la soledad really captured the image of womanhood that prevails in Latinas' minds. The cultura's predominantly Catholic mandates grant Latina identity in the context of the ideal woman, the Virgin Mary, the model of perfection, self-sacrificing mother who lives to please and serve her family. The construct called Marianismo sharply contrasts with the better-known counterpart, machismo, which molds men as cold, intellectual, rational, profound, strong, authoritarian, independent, and brave. Sadly, these descriptions and roles are not del tiempo de las nanas, they permeate society today. And sexuality is a third location within the cultura latina that has an impact on the human environment. The feminization of gay Latinos and masculinization of Latinas lesbianas elucidate the manipulation of cultural tropes to relegate all women and gay men to subordinated status. The syllogism goes as follows. Women are less than men, men who love men are like women, thus gay men like women are less than men, they are not hombres de verdad. Castro's equality rhetoric did not extend to homosexuality. In fact, rejecting homosexuality and adopting stereotypical feminizing language, Castro stated that, quote, no homosexual can represent the revolution, which is a matter of men of fists, not of feathers, of courage, and not of trembling. That culture also persists. But let's look at the third critical component performing the human environment, the people, la gente cubana. It is the people who have the right to enjoy the healthy environment that, as I have read, should embrace not only the traditional environmental concerns, but also human existence, including the panoply of rights afforded by human rights norms. What Cubans on the island want echoes the patria y vida cries of recent demonstrations. Many understand they're performing life within a climate in which they must be careful about what they say. Many don't like the government. They certainly don't want to be beat up or put in jail for speaking their minds or performing their art. They want economic opportunity. They want to keep the advances in healthcare and education. They want freedom to live within their known society. They want reform within the system. During colonialism, Cuban's nationalism came to the fore, and it still presently exists amidst the repressive government. Yet, that independent, indomitable spirit exhibited by the criollos prevails, and it will reject any outsider-imposed change. Throughout history, Afro-Cubans and Cuban women, Afro-Cuban and white alike, have played key roles in the evolution of the island society. Cuba has benefited from Afro-Cuban and Cuban women's activism and patriotism. Yet, while their civic, political, and military participation has directly triggered an effective positive change, they have not always been full beneficiaries, at least in the public manifestation of change. Recent uprisings reveal the depth and persistence of the nationalism of the criollos. The 2018 Movimiento San Isidro, a response to Decree 349, in which the government required that before any work of art or performance could be exhibited, artists had to submit and receive permission from the Ministry of Culture, backfired. They used the law to protest and show exactly and do exactly what the law prohibited. Tellingly, while the cultural hierarchies of the past remain in force today, with Afro-Cubans reportedly subjected to a higher degree of government repression, it was Afro-Cubans who sparked the largest civil uprising in Cuba since the revolution, 11J. LGBTQ Cubans also have suffered a crackdown of liberty. And Las Madres, ranging from Las Madres en Blanco to Madres who are protesting 11J, have taken to the streets and to social media to expose the government's human rights violations. They too suffered crackdowns. The result of protests are not surprising, but Afro-Cubans, women, and LGBT Cubans have acted and exposed as well as rejected the repressive human rights violating nature of the regime. Women, Afro-Cubans, LGBTQ Cubans want reform in their land, their way. In conclusion, Cuba is complicated. It generates remarkable conversations. Emotions, not always supported by facts, run high, whether it's colonialism, the embargo or blockade, the Castro buzz, 11D or 11J, 17D or 11J. To understand the Cuban people's reactions to historical events, one has to look through the Cubans' lens of invasion, colonization, resistance, racialized, gendered, and sexuality cultural tropes. To their indomitable spirit, nothing will stand in the way. From the criollos to the present in the island as well as in Cuban diaspora, the spirit of nationalism of the Cuban peoples is an essential, indeed the most significant part of the human environment. Cuban on the islands, including dissidents, want to better their condition. Their desire is to effect change within the existing regime. To be sure, they want reforms to the system, they want respect for human rights. They clamor for more freedoms, more active participation in government, the ability to gather, the right to join unions, the ability to perform their art, and the right to criticize the government without risking their jobs, liberties, freedoms, or lives. I don't have time to go into this, but I am working on a large project I call Awakening the Law, El Despertamiento del Derecho. In this context, each element of the human environment can become awakened when the people take justice into their hands and have their voices heard. Just like the traditional notion of environment is ultimately about people, the human environment, framed by government and colored by culture, is about people, their desire, indeed their right, to be free, to determine their destiny, to have their rights recognized and their dignity respected. That is what the Cuban people have performed, from the criollos to 11J, in and for the human environment. And in doing so, they're stirring an awakening. Thank you.
Professor Espino, would you like to offer some brief comments?
I'm going to make some comments on the paper. Very nice presentation, which is good because I just got the paper, so I'm not ready. But I'm going to divide my comments into two aspects, okay? And the first one has to do with the problem of environmental protection in Cuba due to the fact that it's a plan economy, that it's a land economy. And the other one is the problem of environmental regulation or protection in Cuba due to the fact that it's a developing country, that it's not, that's not a developing country, okay? So on the first one, for those of you who have studied environmental economics, the basis of the environmental problem from an economics point of view is the fact that the public nature of the environment, makes the market fail. So it's a market failure, okay? Something recognized a long time ago. The solution, therefore, is to internalize the cost of the environment, okay? So when I started studying environmental economics in the 70s. It's one of my fields of studies. Early on, not too many people were doing it at the time. But I was lucky enough that I was in Florida State, and they had a program on environmental and natural resources economics. Okay? And early on, I read a paper, a very famous seminal paper by Marshall Goldberg. I don't know if any of you know what it is, and it's called the convergence of environmental disruption. Okay, in which he argued says that you would think that if the fact that the environment is a problem of market failure, then countries that do not have markets are better set to, in fact, take care of the environmental problems. Okay? Says, but you would argue wrong. Okay? And he went into a couple of reasons why it would not be so. Okay? And I think those reasons, and using the example of the Soviet Union, who was being at the time faced with environmental disasters, right and left. Okay, and he basically, goes through all of them, and those are still relevant to Cuba, and I think they need to be addressed. Okay, which is number one, the lack of, I'll just go into there, competing interests, like you said. Okay, if you have a market economy and the interest is to increase production, okay, and the country wants to increase production, then you cannot be the same entity. Okay, you cannot be the same entity that reduces production to protect the environment, or incur costs to protect the environment. Okay? So there's an inherent a conflict of interest between different goals of the The second one is another one was basically the lack of rule of law, of a system of rights, of personal and individual rights that will allow somebody to sue, and maybe to sue or to. Another one is the lack of ability to create interest groups that would pressure for the environment. And though I know there has been attempts to do this in Cuba, to organize, they have not been very effective. Okay, so that's one of the problems. Now I want to look at from another point, like I say, Cuba is a developing country, and a country that I think we all hope is one in the transitioning into a market economy. Okay, and we still think it's in the future, but what? The right to an environment is embedded in just about every environmental law in Latin America, for example. In fact, it's in the constitution of a couple of them, a couple of them. And again, but what does this mean? Okay, what does this mean? Okay, well, if you live in a society, okay, where there's means and there's individual rights, and there is a vehicle for, suing for your rights, well, this might be a solution, not a very efficient solution from an economics point of view. But this is, at least a way, to demand that that your rights have been violated because there's a factory next to you that's polluting the air. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Okay. But the biggest problem from everything, and I haven't seen this new law, is that not only do we have the conflicts going on at the same time, but that you look at the problem of the environment as a technical scientific one. And though it is partly technically scientifically, it's also political, social, economics. Okay? That means it calls for a regulatory system. Okay? A regulatory system does not exist in Cuba right now, where I don't think people are being capacitated for that regulatory system. Okay? And one that is necessary. Okay? So it's not only, setting of norms, the cost-benefit analysis of norms, it's not only the monitoring, it is also the enforcement of those norms, And I am talking about, what is the most efficient way, Because if you go through technical, just basically technical solutions, it might end up being impossibly costly for the nation to do so, Economic incentive, in a market economy would be a lot more cost efficient. All right. So my biggest concern in the whole process is the lack of a regulatory class. And I just throw in here, there's a lot of concern about the future of Cuba and the entrepreneurs and building the entrepreneur sector. And to me, what we are not talking about, what we are not perceiving is that what we need is also the administrative sector. How to train how to capacitate the administrators. But a lot of us, have done through in different times of our life. The regulation, not only in the environment, labor laws. How do you regulate that? Monopoly, antitrust regulation. And there's little emphasis being put in that area of capacitation, which which is needed right now, but it will be even more needed as Cuba transition into a more market economy. So with that, I will just put it down.
Thank you very much for illuminating.
Thank you. I want to say that I got this paper very late last night after dinner. And however, I think that what has enabled me to be a discussant is the fact that Professor Hernandez-Trujillo's paper is in fact beautifully written. It's very clear, it's very sweeping. It is in fact to me remarkable that you begin with the criollos, 18th, 19th century, and you end with the MSI, the San Isidro movement. You divide what you have to say into a triad. I guess one would say that you call the human environment. And by the way, what you call the human environment, I think is what a sociologist would call society, which is composed of government, the culture, and the people. And you go through all three of them, I think, very well, pointing out particularly the relationship of Cuba to the United States, and you talk about the blockade, as Cuba prefers to call the embargo. And at the end of the paper, you talk about Cubans want to reform their society without meddling. I would say that that's true, but it is I think that when you think about meddling, it's not just the Americans that have meddled, it's also the Russians, it's also most recently the Venezuelans. It would be very nice to have a society without meddling, but before we can achieve that, I think we have to achieve a more independent, economically and socially speaking and politically speaking society, which is a very large task that we have not yet been very good at. So I would say that there are in Cuba two blockades, not just that of the United States, but also that of the government towards its people. And people in Cuba talk that way about it. They say, hay dos bloqueos, However, most of the paper, as I said, it's beautifully written, it's very interesting. And I think that the point where I take issue with you is towards the end of the paper, that you insist that what Cubans in Cuba want is to reform their land and their society, but not to change it into a different type of society, just to reform, okay? And I have here the very conclusion of the paper, which I would like to be very specific about. You say Cubans on the island, including dissidents, want to better their condition. Their desire is to effect change within the existing regime. To be sure, they want reforms to the system, such as more freedoms, more active participation in government, the ability to gather, the right to join unions, the ability to perform their art, and the right to criticize the government without risking their jobs, liberties, freedoms, or lives. Most significantly, the Cuban people want to attain those goals without risking returning to colonial oppression. They want to create their own human environment of national pride, racial, sex, and sexuality equality without meddling. I would say that if Cubans were able to achieve all the things that you have put together very nicely in that paragraph, that they would in fact be doing far more than just reforming the existing regime. They would in fact be constructing a different type of society, okay? In sociology, we distinguish between social movements, which aim to reform a society, and revolutions, which aim to first take over government and then effect profound changes in the society. And I would say that this is really more in the area not of the social movement that just wants to reform the society, as was the case, for example, of the American Civil Rights Movement, that it's really more in the terms of a revolution, that it's a very profound set of changes that will in fact involve having a different type of government. So I do agree with the things that you say that Cubans want. I just disagree with calling them reforms within the system. I think that they would in fact be very profound social and political and economic changes that would usher in a different society, which would necessarily be freer politically speaking. Thank you.
So let us
let's open, we don't have too much time left, but let me open it up to questions or comments. Yes.
El problema de conflicto interinstitucional probablemente es que está demorando que se publique en la Gaceta Oficial, ha ocurrido lo mismo en otros países. ¿Cómo se resuelve eso? ¿Hay una solución específica? ¿La jerarquía de los ministerios se altera? Eso siempre es obviamente objetado violentamente por los otros ministerios. ¿O existe un tribunal especial dentro del sistema judicial que pueda dirimir conflictos entre los ministerios?
I'd like to take, if there are other questions, take a few and then have them all answer together. Yes.
Mi pregunta es, ¿cuál sería el impacto de la nueva ley ambiental? Como hay una diferencia de criterios entre ministerios, porque tengo en mente son experiencias de hace muchos años, cuando el desarrollo del turismo arranca, que hay una crítica de la Academia de Ciencias con relación a la construcción de terraplenes para el acceso a los callos, la construcción de hoteles sobre las playas, y en aquel momento la Academia de Ciencias tenía menos peso, y esa fue parte de la justificación del establecimiento del ministerio. La nueva ley trata problemas de ese tipo si vuelven a surgir.
Any other questions before we give the panelists a chance to respond? So, can I just translate that first part? Because he thinks that both questions go in the same direction, and the question is in terms of, just to summarize for people that might have missed it, the first question is the fact that the new law had not been published in the official Gazette because of the internal conflict over it, and is there a procedure to resolve that conflict so the law actually gets published and becomes effective? And the other question is, how about the differences in terms of the different ministries, different administrative agencies within Cuba that, due to their internal conflict, might not allow the implementation of the new law? And President Dominguez gave an example of that happening in the past.
A special court within the judicial system to balance out interministerial conflicts.
Right, and the question was, does such a thing exist?
Una de las, digamos que de los objetivos con los que se aprobó la nueva ley es trabajar en esos dos aspectos. Uno, perfeccionar el sistema de solución de conflictos en sentido general ambiental, incluidas las reclamaciones que presenta la ciudadanía, y trabajar también en la solución de discrepancias entre los distintos organismos de la administración.
So that is part of what they've tried to work on specifically because of the past experience with the differences in interpretations, I guess, of the law and policies. So one is the idea of the conflict of laws, so that there would be a mechanism for that, to conflicting legal interpretations or plans, and then also differences amongst the administrative units.
En el caso de las normas más generales, hay competencia en las salas de los administrativos de los tribunales provinciales para conocer de las reclamaciones no solo por daño ambiental concreto, sino por incumplimiento de la legislación ambiental. Y aquí la novedad está en que se prevé la posibilidad de que una institución pública del propio Ministerio de Ciencia, Tecnología y Medio Ambiente le pueda reclamar judicialmente a otro organismo de la Administración Central del Estado el cumplimiento de la legislación ambiental. No sería el mismo ministro, sino el delegado del ministro en cada provincia.
Right. So the idea is that they are establishing jurisdiction with a general jurisdiction in the provincial courts. So it was subdivided provincial courts, and I think even supreme provincial courts, right, a court hierarchy with that. so that when it becomes actionable, it's not only environmental harm, but violations of the environmental legislation. And that in a way that even public institutions can be sued. So the delegate of the Minister for Science, Technology, and the Environment, the delegate at the provincial level could sue in provincial court against other administrative units.
De hecho, si quiere, uno de los principios, digamos que más conocidos en el país, antes de la promulgación de la ley, se dio precisamente entre dos organismos, entre una empresa estatal y varios organismos de la Administración Central del Estado, porque tenía que ver con contaminación de una instalación fabril en la provincia de Camagüey. El reclamante es la propia instalación fabril a la que se le obliga administrativamente a cambiar de tecnología. Pero la instalación fabril estaba en el sitio antes del asentamiento poblacional que estaba siendo afectado. Luego, la empresa lo que reclama es que el costo del cambio de tecnología no puede ser asumido solamente por la empresa, sino también por el Estado, porque es una decisión estatal la localización del asentamiento cerca de la empresa. Y por tanto, entre los organismos demandados estuvo la autoridad urbana, urbanística, planificación física, el Ministerio de Ciencia, Tecnología y Medio Ambiente.
Esto fue antes de la promulgación.
Antes de la promulgación.
So even before the passing of this law, which again is not in effect yet, even the old law, actually this kind of inter-agency conflict is one of the biggest cases that they've had is a situation of kind of inter-agency conflict in which a state-run enterprise sues the administration, specifically the Urban Authority and the Ministry of Science and Technology, based on a regulation that they were required to internalize the cost of cleanup of pollution in their area, in which they were next to a populational settlement. And the claim that the state-run enterprise brought against the state is that the state needed to assume some of the costs of the cleanup and what they would take to comply with the environmental law, because it was the state that told them where they should be located, forced them to be there.
La ley nueva prevé un procedimiento administrativo para la solución de discrepancias entre organismos estatales, que no es este. La propuesta de la solución la daría siempre el Ministerio de Ciencia, Tecnología y Medio Ambiente. Si no se llega a esa solución, porque evidentemente se trataría de un litigio entre iguales, hay una propuesta, o sea, se elevaría la propuesta de solución al primer ministro, que es el superior de los dos, lo que hay un mandato para que el SIGMA emita un dictamen que sea el que se eleve al primer ministro con una propuesta de solución.
Sigma?
El Ministerio de Ciencia, Tecnología y Medio Ambiente.
Sorry. And so within the new law, it's regulated and codified a new administrative procedure in which there would be conflict resolution, in which the settlement proposal would be at the initiative of the Minister of Science, Technology, and Environmental Matters. And it would be a consented settlement if it occurs, and if parties don't consent, then it would be elevated to the Prime Minister.
Por supuesto, nada garantiza que la solución del primer ministro sea la ambientalmente correcta, pero al menos tendría que ir contra un dictamen de la autoridad ambiental.
So nothing guarantees that it would be the decision of the Prime Minister would be the environmentally correct decision, but in any case, the Prime Minister would have to go against a proposal of the Ministry of the Environment.
Yes. Is there something similar in Cuba like we have in Puerto Rico, where with something of an environmental impact starts at the municipality, where the case is heard by the neighbors, and then the municipal authority that is elected or nominated in either case has to take the responsibility of approving it or denying it, but it has the benefit of going to the municipality and have both parties obligated to hear what the people in the municipality or others that are affected are heard, because what I hear, it looks like in Cuba, everything is at the top level. Nothing filters down. What is it? How is it?
One more question over here. So you have a
The one thing I haven't heard, lo único que no he escuchado de todo este esquema es el papel del Ministerio de Hacienda. ¿Quién paga por los costos de limpiar el sistema?
The one thing I haven't heard is what's the role of the Ministry of the environment? Of all kinds of finance. Who pays for environmental?
La pregunta suya me lleva a algo de lo planteado por la doctora previamente, ¿no? Llevar a esas decisiones a nivel municipal en Cuba hoy no es práctico, no es posible, porque sencillamente los municipios no tienen la capacidad, no estoy hablando de capacidad legal, sino personal técnico para tomar esa decisión. A lo que se suma el factor que señalaba al principio la profesora, y el hecho de que aquí no estamos hablando en contradicción interés ambiental, económico, privado, público, ¿no? Muchas veces la decisión que se toma ahí es también de interés público, aunque no sea ambiental. Y precisamente las decisiones técnicas autorizatorias en materia ambiental se han permanecido o han permanecido en la autoridad regulatoria ambiental, en el Ministerio de Ciencia, Tecnología y Medio Ambiente, y no en los gobiernos, para que el gobierno no presione por los otros intereses económicos que pueda haber en la demarcación y el municipio.
So the response to that is that the municipalities don't really have the technical capacity to do it, and the centralization is also sort of a way to prevent kind of other political pressures, I guess, on the municipalities, right? So the decision remains within the Ministry of the Environment.
Implícito en la pregunta anterior estaba la necesidad de audiencia pública. Tú mencionaste de que sí, que se requieren audiencias públicas a nivel mínimo, independientemente de lo que contestaste, ¿verdad? Entonces es importante que el público entienda de que se van a hacer audiencias públicas en esos casos.
De hecho, o sea, una de las deficiencias que veíamos en el proceso de evaluación de impacto ambiental de la ley 81 es que nominalmente estaba la consulta, y en la práctica se realizaba en 1% mínimo de las licencias ambientales concedidas.
Audiencia pública para la licencia.
Para la licencia,
licencia.
Exactamente. Por suerte, incluso la Constitución de 2019 tiene una cápita que permite realizar lo que le llama la Constitución consulta popular, que no tiene nada que ver con la del Código de las Familias, sino como una consulta a nivel local.
This exchange is about public hearings in terms of prior to the giving of an environmental license for a project or some sort of development, and that this law has, and the Constitution also provides for. There was one last question.
So, yo quisiera saber qué papel juega la Fundación Antonio Jiménez en proveer quizás asesoría técnica o quizás implementar la legislación, o al mismo tener alguna consultoría. ¿Qué papel juega esa fundación?
What role does the Jimenez Foundation play in consulting on environmental matters?
Se me quedó algo también de la ronda anterior, que era lo del Ministerio de Finanzas.
Oh.
La cartera. Ahí la ley intenta subvertir, digamos, que el paradigma de la ley anterior, que era puro instrumento administrativo, dando espacio a instrumentos, a los llamados instrumentos económicos, entre ellos instrumentos fiscales. Se vienen aplicando algunos tributos ambientales por vertimiento en bahías, en cuencas hidrográficas, pero con alcance muy limitado. Entre los objetivos de la ley es generalizar esas experiencias. Y en el caso de la fundación, su labor fundamentalmente ha ido dirigida en la práctica o a educación ambiental o a recuperación de sitios determinados, trabajo con la comunidad. Ahora es importante que en este sistema de los recursos naturales y medio ambiente que se está creando con la ley y que es necesario reglamentar, preceptivamente está la presencia de la sociedad civil. Y por tanto, dentro del sistema no van a estar organismos públicos solos, sino presencia de esa sociedad civil, y evidentemente la sociedad civil incluye a la fundación, a Pro Naturaleza, que es sociedad, y otros existentes.
I think response it was about who's paying for this, and part of the answer is that the law provides for some economic instruments, like environmental tax, this tax on polluters for runoff into bays, estuaries, that kind of thing, and also focus on environmental education and recovery and participation by civil society. I'm not sure how participation by civil society, in what context. ¿En qué contexto es la participación de la sociedad civil?
En este caso, en la ley está previsto, digo, a ese nivel, que cuando funcione el Sistema Nacional de Recursos Naturales y Medio Ambiente con representantes, no solo del Ministerio de Ciencia, Tecnología y Medio Ambiente, Recursos Hidráulicos, Agricultura, las decisiones, o sea, la sociedad civil esté presente ahí, y por supuesto manifieste su criterio sobre los asuntos.
En unas comisiones nuevas.
Es un sistema nuevo que trata de integrar todos esos organismos con competencias ambientales.
Yo tengo una pregunta ahí, que en los años 90 se supo que emergieron una serie de grupos ambientalistas independientes, y la mayoría de los que fundaron esos grupos están aquí, porque se tuvieron que ir. O sea, ¿qué garantía se ofrece bajo esta nueva legislación que en realidad va a haber participación del público en las decisiones ambientales? Pero bueno, elevar su propio.
And this is the last question. How about environmental groups and environmental activists that were active in the past in Cuba, but who are all now here in Miami?
Hay un detalle, evidentemente la pregunta tiene un alcance que no es ambiental. Lo que yo responda depende de lo que diga la ley de asociaciones, no de lo que diga la ley de... Pero sí hay varios detalles en la nueva ley ambiental que al menos crean el espacio para esa participación y que antes no existía. En primer lugar, el hecho de que pueda reclamar ante un tribunal tanto una persona natural como cualquier persona jurídica, que esa persona jurídica no tenga que demostrar un daño directo, sino simplemente con conocer la existencia del daño o incluso con conocer la posibilidad de que el daño se produzca. Eso es un paso de avance. Evidentemente está hablando de personas jurídicas. Eso implica personas jurídicas constituidas, inscritas. En este caso sí cabría la fundación y las demás que están inscritas. En los últimos años ha habido, yo creo que un movimiento interesante de activismo no inscrito. Lo vimos con el movimiento animalista y presumiblemente lo vamos a ver también en los temas ambientales.
So the response is that actually some parts of the law provide for an opening for activists, and that the standing requirement for tort law is expanded to folks that are not negatively affected personally. So anyone can sue, so that potentially allows for activists or plaintiffs, right, to pursue that, and was confirming the existence of like animal rights groups and things like that. I just wanted to conclude by giving our two panelists, especially Berta, a chance to respond to some of the discussion that Silvia brought up, because nobody's touched it, but it's kind of the elephant in the room, and that is our skepticism in the US about, and maybe outside of Cuba, about law in the books versus law in action. And Berta really brings us to the inaction part, the context in which this is occurring, the culture, the people, and honestly, really, with so many problems in Cuba, it is really environmental law a focus at all, being a developing country, a centralized planning, and I think that this exchange really brings that out. So I want to give you at least a little bit of time to say something.
I was expecting silence, because it is a difficult conversation. But difficult conversations have to be had. And it is not the first time that I get silence when I talk about Cuba. It's nicer to have silence than pure hostility, which I also have experienced. But I think it's very important to talk about it. I really appreciate your comments. I'm writing the paper through my legal lens. So my concept of reform is not a sociological concept of reform. And I actually debated as to whether write it, through sort of like a postmodern RE/form, which might embrace the notion of more than just keeping the status quo, because I think that status quo needs to be disrupted. The status quo is now not in Cuba, not in the United States, not anywhere in the world, a neutral position, and it is something that needs to be questioned and disrupted, because as long as we accept the status quo, then we are just accepting everything that has been before without any form of critical analysis. I am the eternal optimist. In fact, my class is always 3/4 full. But I am not shy about confronting difficult issues. We have had this history, right? And Cuba has had this history. It's never had a successful democratic government. And that has been sometimes because of internal forces and sometimes because of external forces. And I think those need to be recognized as well. I agree that there's other meddling. I think that when I wrote that, I was intentional in not saying US meddling. But I have to look at the paper at some point. But that might be a wonderful place for a footnote to expand it, so I appreciate that. And I think that I am not, I don't call it, unlike Jose, I don't call it bloqueo, I call it embargo. But I can perceive the Cuban peoples inside talking about two bloqueos. I only spoke about one, and that was not the economic embargo, but the internal bloqueo, with the tension. I didn't use that language, but maybe I will incorporate that as well. But that is the resistance we are seeing.
Please join me in giving a big round of applause to our panelists.